Far out in the Indonesian archipelago, beyond the restless surf and the tangled chains of volcanic islands, lies a place that seems suspended between worlds. Flores is not an island that announces itself with grandeur. Instead, it whispers. Its mountains rise like ancient vertebrae beneath a cloak of drifting mist, their slopes carved by centuries of rain, ash, and forgotten histories. To step onto Flores is to enter a realm where time folds in on itself, where nature keeps secrets with a stubborn, almost sacred patience. And somewhere within this vast green labyrinth, hidden behind a veil of limestone and silence, rests the story of a human species unlike any other, so small, so unexpected, that their existence would shake the foundations of what we believed humanity to be. Before the archaeologists, before the excavations, before the world came to know of tiny humans who once walked its forests, Flores was already a place shaped by isolation. Cradled by the restless forces of shifting tectonic plates, the island rose and fell over millions of years, at times connected to larger land masses, but more often cut off entirely. Species arrived here by chance, swept by storms, carried on floating vegetation, or pushed by migratory instincts, and once marooned, they adapted or vanished. The island became an evolutionary crucible, a place where the rules bent, where giants shrank and predators grew large, where nature sculpted life with a strange and unpredictable hand. To many who visit today, Flores seems peaceful. Villages sit quietly beneath towering bamboo groves, and the sounds of distant waterfalls mingle with the calls of birds drifting through the morning air. But beneath this tranquility lies a rugged, untamed heart. Volcanoes brood beneath the surface, their heat shaping the land in bursts of violent transformation. Caverns snake through the limestone hills, some so deep that daylight never touches their interiors. Forests grow thick and shadowed, concealing species found nowhere else on Earth. This is the Flores that existed long before modern humans ever set foot here, a world raw, mysterious, and indifferent to the dramas of our species. For hundreds of thousands of years, winds swept across these highlands, carrying whispers of creatures long extinct. Giant storks strode through the grasslands, dwarf elephants moved in quiet herds along riverbanks, and lurking in the undergrowth, massive lizards, the ancestors of today's Komodo dragons, waited for opportunity. Life here was always in delicate balance, shaped not by abundance, but by limitation. Resources were scarce, distances were small, and isolation pressed upon every organism, forcing them to adapt in ways that seemed almost fantastical. And somewhere in this isolated crucible, a different kind of adaptation was taking place, one that would eventually leave behind a trail of bones in a cave called Liangbua. But long before those bones were noticed, before anyone had reason to suspect that an entirely distinct human species existed here, Flores carried this story quietly. The mountains knew. The forests knew. The cave knew. It simply waited for humans, modern humans, to be curious enough to listen. When we think of our distant relatives, we imagine larger-than-life figures, the broad-shouldered silhouettes of Neanderthals, the tireless persistence of Homo erectus, the fragile ingenuity of early Homo sapiens. We rarely imagine smallness. We rarely imagine fragility expressed through a reduction of form. Yet Flores tells us that the human story is far more diverse than we assumed. Before the discovery that would make global headlines, the island already held in its limestone corridors evidence of a species that defied expectations, a species no taller than 3 feet, with a brain barely larger than a grapefruit, yet possessing the unmistakable posture and gait of humanity. But at this point in our story, none of this is known. We begin in the stillness before the revelation. The section is a breath, a moment to settle into the environment that shaped everything. The land itself becomes a character, ancient, watchful, and full of quiet contradictions. Flores is a place where the past clings stubbornly to the present, where myths seep into landscapes, and where science would eventually uncover truths far stranger and more humbling than folklore. Imagine walking through the island's dense interior, hearing the rhythmic hum of insects that have evolved in almost total isolation, feeling the air grow thick with moisture as clouds roll down the mountainsides. The deeper you go, the more you sense that this place has existed on its own terms for an unfathomable span of time. Every ridge, every river valley, every stretch of tangled vegetation has witnessed ages of change, extinction, survival, and transformation. The island remembers, even if the world has forgotten. And so, our journey begins here, not with the discovery itself, but with the setting that made such a discovery possible. We stand before Flores the way early explorers once did, with curiosity, humility, and the feeling that we are stepping into a story larger than ourselves. The island invites us inward, toward caves carved by water and time, toward landscapes that shaped life through scarcity and challenge, toward the quiet echoes of beings who lived and died long before written memory. The tale of the Hobbits, of Homo floresiensis, cannot be understood without first understanding this island. Its isolation was not merely geographic, it was transformative. It shaped bodies, behaviors, and entire species. It forced evolution down narrow, unconventional paths. And in doing so, it created a world where tiny humans could flourish for tens of thousands of years, unknown to the rest of humanity. This is the threshold of their story. A story born from silence. A story held in stone and shadow. A story that waited, patiently, for the day we would finally uncover it. In 2003, deep within the rugged heart of Flores, a team of archaeologists stepped into the darkness of Liang Bua Cave with no expectation of rewriting human history. They came searching for signs of ancient migration, remnants of early Homo sapiens, or clues of long-lost cultural layers. What waited for them beneath the dust and stone was something altogether different, something so unexpected that even seasoned researchers hesitated to trust their own eyes. Liang Bua was already known as a cavern of secrets, its towering chamber marked by thousands of years of sediment, but nothing hinted that the cave concealed the remains of a human species the world had never seen before. The team began their work the way archaeologists often do, carefully scraping away soil layer by layer, cataloging every shard of pottery, every bone fragment, every hint of ancient life. The daylight streamed faintly through the cave's entrance, fading into a soft glow that barely touched the deeper recesses. Each sound, trowels on stone, whispered observations, shifting sand, echoed strangely in the vast chamber. They expected to find routine artifacts, perhaps some remains of early humans, but the initial signs were ordinary enough: animal bones, stone tools, charcoal, the faintest hints of habitation. Nothing seemed unusual until a peculiar collection of bones emerged from the sediment. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. The bones were clearly human, yet shockingly small. A skull barely larger than that of a chimpanzee. Limb bones that looked almost childlike in proportion, yet with the distinctive morphology of an adult. The pelvis, the femur, the teeth, everything pointed toward maturity, not infancy. Silence settled over the excavation as the team examined the remains, confusion mixing with a rising sense of intrigue. If this was a human, then it was unlike any human they had ever encountered. If it was a child, then its proportions made no sense. The team's initial assumption was that the skeleton must belong to a modern human with a disease or developmental disorder, something that stunted growth or impaired anatomy. But as they continued to uncover more bones, the mystery deepened. The skull's features, though diminutive, were distinct. The mandible was shaped differently from that of Homo sapiens. The wrists and shoulder structures resembled those of much older human ancestors. Each new piece of bone added weight to the impossible. This was no malformed member of our species. This was something else entirely. When the first near-complete skeleton, later dubbed LB1, was fully exposed, the cave atmosphere shifted from curiosity to astonishment. LB1 stood roughly 3 feet tall in life, with a brain volume of about 400 cubic centimeters, yet displayed signs of upright walking and tool use. The find was so unexpected that members of the team reportedly questioned whether their measurements were accurate, whether their instruments were malfunctioning, or whether some sort of misclassification had occurred. But the bones were real. And they were ancient. Word spread quickly through the scientific community, and Liang Bua transformed overnight from a quiet archaeological site into the focal point of global attention. Researchers were flown in to verify the findings, cameras documented every inch of the site, and academic debates erupted before the bones had even been fully analyzed. The tiny stature, the strange proportions, and the implications of such a species living on Flores sparked a mixture of excitement and skepticism that few discoveries in paleoanthropology ever achieve. The cave itself played an unspoken role in this revelation. Liang Bua's sheer scale echoed with history. Its cathedral-like chamber had sheltered countless generations of life. Stalactites hung like ancient guardians watching over the excavation. The sediment floor held stories compressed by thousands of years of environmental change. Every layer peeled back by the archaeologists represented not just time, but transformation, shifts in climate, migration patterns, and species survival. And now, those layers had given way to a species that defied the conventional timeline of human evolution. As the team continued their meticulous excavation, they discovered stone tools scattered near the Hobbit remains, tools that were surprisingly sophisticated. Sharp-edged flakes, scraping implements, and signs of controlled craftsmanship suggested that the tiny humans who lived here possessed skills far exceeding what their small brains might imply. The tools complicated the narrative, hinting at intelligence that challenged mainstream assumptions about cognitive ability and brain volume. The deeper they dug, the more evidence surfaced, more bones, more clues, more traces of an unknown way of life. The discovery began to take shape not as a single skeleton, but as a portrait of an entire population of small-bodied humans who had once lived, hunted, cooked, and died on this island. Liang Bua had not merely preserved bones, it had preserved a window into a forgotten branch of our human family tree. Yet with every revelation came a wave of uncertainty. What species were these tiny humans? How long had they lived on Flores? Were they descendants of Homo erectus that had shrunk over generations due to isolation? Or did they represent something even older, perhaps a lineage that split off early in human evolution? None of the possible answers felt complete. Each theory opened new questions, new possibilities, and new contradictions. By the time the first publications were released, the scientific world was divided. Some hailed the discovery as monumental, one of the most significant paleoanthropological breakthroughs in a century. Others insisted it must be an error, a misinterpretation, or an anomaly. But regardless of doubt, curiosity took root. Liang Bua had revealed a species that seemed more myth than reality, a species that had existed alongside our ancestors without ever leaving a trace in our collective memory. In that dim, echoing cave on Flores, the bones of Homo floresiensis emerged from the earth like a message from a forgotten epoch. They invited humanity to reconsider everything we thought we knew about our origins, our diversity, and the winding paths evolution can take when isolation becomes the sculptor. The limestone veil had been lifted, and the world would never look at human history the same way again. When the bones of Homo floresiensis were first laid out on the examination table, the sense of wonder was immediate and overwhelming. Here were the remains of a being that, despite its size, fit unmistakably within the human family. The skeleton was tiny, so small that it would have stood no higher than the hip of an average modern human. Yet the proportions were contradictory. The legs were surprisingly long relative to the torso, the feet were almost disproportionately large, and the shoulders carried a primitive robustness not seen in our species for millions of years. This was the first moment the world glimpsed the true shape of the Hobbit, a creature that looked both familiar and ancient. The skull of LB1, the most complete specimen, became an icon of scientific fascination. Its brain case was shockingly small, around 400 cubic centimeters, no larger than that of a chimpanzee. But the shape of the skull, particularly the rounded cranium and facial structure, displayed traits associated with much more advanced hominins. The juxtaposition felt impossible. How could a creature with such a small brain possess the unmistakable hallmarks of upright, bipedal walking? How could it produce tools, organize hunting strategies, or wield fire? These questions hung heavily over the first analyses, pushing researchers to move beyond simple comparisons and open themselves to new evolutionary possibilities. The teeth offered another layer of complexity. Unlike many ancient hominins with larger, more primitive molars, Homo floresiensis had teeth that were relatively modern in shape, small, with delicate enamel patterns more typical of Homo erectus or early Homo sapiens. This combination of a miniature skull but modern-looking dentition deepened the mystery. Were these tiny humans descendants of a more advanced species that had shrunk over time, or were they holdovers from a more ancient branch that preserved unexpected traits? The limb bones told their own story. The femur and tibia displayed clear signs of habitual upright walking. The structure of the knee joint supported stable, bipedal locomotion. Despite their tiny size, the bones were thick and sturdy, adapted for a physically demanding life. The upper body, however, revealed more primitive features. The wrist bones, for example, were shaped in a way that resembled the wrists of much older hominins, such as Homo habilis. The shoulder girdle was oriented differently from that of modern humans, giving the hobbit a posture that may have been slightly forward-leaning, somewhere between modern human and early human ancestor. These mixed features, some ancient, some surprisingly modern, made the hobbit unlike any other species known. In the fossil record, hominins typically fall within certain evolutionary patterns. Larger brains accompany more complex tools, more modern anatomy appears in tandem with increased cognitive ability, and physical traits generally align with chronological age in a predictable way. But Homo floresiensis broke every rule. It was a species that seemed to defy the traditional ladder-like image of human evolution, instead presenting a mosaic of traits that hinted at a branching, tangled web of ancestry. As scientists studied the skeleton, they began reconstructing what life might have been like for these small-bodied humans. The large, flat feet, nearly as long as the femur, suggested they walked with a slightly awkward gait, perhaps a slower, swaying stride. The toes were long, the arches shallow. Yet the overall structure still supported efficient movement across uneven, volcanic terrain. Their hands, though small, were capable of precision gripping. The proportions of their fingers and thumbs indicated the ability to craft tools and manipulate objects with surprising dexterity. Perhaps most intriguing was the structure of the brain case. While small, the interior shape suggested that certain areas related to planning, memory, and motor skills were relatively well developed. The relief patterns inside the skull hinted at neurological organization that exceeded expectations for such a small brain. It forced scientists to reconsider the assumption that intelligence is directly proportional to brain size. Maybe, in the constrained environment of Flores, evolutionary pressures favored efficiency over expansion, brain wiring over brain volume. The discovery of multiple individuals further confirmed that this was not an isolated anomaly. Additional skeletal fragments, jaw bones, arm bones, leg bones, belonged to individuals of similar diminutive size. This consistency made it clear that Homo floresiensis was a stable, reproducing population, not a group of diseased or stunted modern humans. Each new fossil added texture to their physical profile, small but robust, primitive yet unexpectedly capable, strange but undeniably human. Comparisons with Homo erectus, the likely ancestor, revealed more clues. Homo erectus was tall, powerful, and wide-ranging, with a brain nearly 3 times the size of the hobbits. Yet on Flores, if this lineage did indeed give rise to Homo floresiensis, evolution took a dramatically different path. The island's limited resources and isolated conditions would have favored smaller, energy-efficient bodies. Over tens of thousands of years, features could shift, shrink, simplify, or even revert to earlier ancestral states, a process known as island dwarfism. But even this explanation, while compelling, did not fully account for the hobbit's surprising mix of traits. As these anatomical details came together, the emotional weight of the discovery began to settle in. Here was a human species that lived alongside the giants of its ecosystem, navigating the challenges of a harsh island environment with ingenuity and resilience. Here was a species that crafted tools despite a brain size that scientists previously believed incapable of such complexity. And here was a species that had existed in near-total isolation, developing along a unique evolutionary path that diverged sharply from our own. The first footprints of the Hobbit were not literal impressions in the soil, but the anatomical signatures etched into their bones. These bones told a story of survival and adaptation, of a people shaped by constraints and opportunities unlike any other in the human lineage. They walked upright, they used their hands skillfully, they crafted tools, and they lived in social groups that fostered cooperation. They were small in stature but expansive in mystery, a reminder that the human family tree has more branches than we ever imagined. In those early days of analysis, as scientists mapped each curve, socket, and ridge of the Hobbit skeleton, they realized they were confronting a species that both challenged and enriched our understanding of what it means to be human. The bones whispered of an ancient life lived far from the centers of human evolution, a life carved by time, isolation, and the unforgiving forces of nature. And as modern humans held those tiny bones in their hands, they found themselves gazing into a mirror of deep ancestry, one that reflected not our dominance, but our diversity. The announcement of Homo floresiensis to the world did not land softly. It arrived like a shockwave, rippling across scientific institutions, universities, and research centers worldwide. Within hours of the discovery being made public, headlines called the species everything from the tiny mystery human to the greatest evolutionary puzzle of the century. But with the excitement came something equally powerful: disbelief. The scientific community, known for its caution and rigor, was suddenly split between astonishment and doubt. Many researchers simply could not accept that such a small-brained hominin had survived until relatively recent prehistoric times, let alone that it might represent an entirely new species. Skepticism rose swiftly, especially among anthropologists who had spent decades building a coherent timeline of human evolution, a timeline that did not include a 3-foot-tall human cousin living on an isolated island. Some researchers argued that the bones must belong to modern humans suffering from conditions like microcephaly, cretinism, or other growth disorders. To them, the idea of a tiny-bodied human species surviving into the last 50,000 years seemed outrageous. Evolution, as they understood it, had followed a largely linear pattern: increasing brain size, improving tools, advancing behavior. But the Hobbit skeletons turned that narrative upside down, suggesting that evolution could also move sideways, backward, or in circles. The debate quickly escalated into one of the most heated scientific discussions in modern paleoanthropology. Leading experts published papers challenging the species designation, each proposing alternative explanations. Some claimed the skull showed asymmetries common in pathological conditions. Others argued that the small brain size was the result of congenital abnormalities rather than evolutionary adaptation. Conferences turned into arenas of debate, with presentations interrupted by heated questions and sharp criticism. It was as if the discovery had struck a nerve, poking at deeply held assumptions about what made humans unique. But supporters of the new species designation pushed back just as strongly. They highlighted the distinctiveness of the Hobbit skeletons, the primitive wrist, the unusual shoulder orientation, the peculiar shape of the jaw and teeth. These were not traits seen in diseased modern humans, they were evolutionary signatures, patterns carved by tens of thousands of years of adaptation. Pathology might explain one unusual feature, they argued, but not an entire suite of characteristics found consistently across multiple individuals. And pathology certainly could not account for the ancient stone tools discovered in the same layers, tools crafted with skill and intention. As researchers examined the wrist bones more closely, the pathological argument began to unravel. The morphology of the Hobbit's wrist was strikingly similar to that of early hominins, not modern humans. It was not something that could arise from disease. It reflected deep evolutionary ancestry. The structure of the feet further supported the idea of a separate species. Their proportions and bone shapes were primitive in ways that simply did not match modern human variation. Bit by bit, the anatomical evidence built a case that the Hobbit was no malformed Homo sapiens, but a distinct hominin shaped by isolation and time. Still, skepticism persisted, and for good reason. Scientific rigor demands doubt before acceptance. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the idea that a small-brained human species lived in parallel with modern humans, crafting tools, surviving predators, navigating landscapes, was extraordinary in every sense. The scientific method demanded scrutiny, and scrutiny came in waves. Some skeptics traveled to Flores to examine the remains firsthand. Others reanalyzed CT scans, bone measurements, and sediment dating methods. A few conducted comparative studies of modern human pathologies to test whether any condition could replicate the exact features found in the Hobbit bones. The more they tested, the more inconsistencies they uncovered. No known disorder could reproduce the unique combination of traits. The Hobbit's anatomy was too coherent, too internally consistent, too evolutionarily logical within the context of isolation. Slowly, skeptics began to soften their positions. Not all, of course. Some voices remained convinced that the remains represented unusual modern humans. But the center of scientific consensus began shifting. With every new study published, with every new fossil fragment uncovered, the case for Homo floresiensis grew stronger. Even the dating evidence, showing that the species lived until around 50,000 years ago, added weight to the extraordinary but unavoidable conclusion that a tiny human species survived until the era when Homo sapiens had already spread across much of the world. The controversy itself became an important part of the species story. It revealed how deeply rooted our expectations about human evolution had become. It showed how reluctant we are to accept that the human family tree is not a straight line, but a tangled forest of branching paths. It exposed the tendency of science, like any human endeavor, to resist ideas that challenge long-held beliefs. And it demonstrated both the flaws and strengths of scientific discourse, its capacity for heated disagreement, but also its eventual willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads. Beyond the academic debates, the discovery sparked a more philosophical skepticism among the public. How could humans, creatures who pride themselves on their intelligence and dominance, accept the idea of a miniature cousin living in prehistoric times? The Hobbit challenged not just scientific frameworks, but cultural ones. For many people, it blurred the lines between myth and reality. The idea of small, elusive human-like beings living on remote islands summoned echoes of folklore, fairy tales, and indigenous legends. It made some uneasy, others fascinated, and most profoundly curious. Back in the labs, the scientists continued their meticulous work. Their goal was not to silence critics or win arguments, but to uncover truth. Slowly, they pieced together new evidence, comparative measurements, high-resolution scans, micro-wear patterns on tools, and improved dating techniques. Each piece added clarity, pushing the narrative toward acceptance. The Hobbit was real. A species. A relative. A testament to evolution's unpredictability. In time, skepticism became part of the foundation supporting the discovery. Without it, the evidence might not have been examined so thoroughly, the debates might not have reached such depth, and the final conclusions might not have been as strong. The initial backlash, fierce as it was, forced the scientific community to test every detail, every assumption, every hypothesis. And through that fire, a clearer understanding emerged. The story of Homo floresiensis reminds us that science is not a straight path toward truth, but a journey shaped by questioning, challenging, and revising. Skepticism is not a barrier, it is the sculptor of understanding. And as the world came to accept the Hobbit as a genuine member of the human lineage, it also learned something humbling, that our species is not the sole, inevitable outcome of evolution. That other forms of humanity once walked beside us. And that the borders of what we call human are far more expansive than we once believed. On islands across the world, evolution follows rules that seem almost paradoxical. Creatures shrink, predators grow, and ecosystems drift into forms rarely seen on the mainland. This phenomenon, known as the island rule or insular dwarfism, becomes a silent architect, reshaping bodies, behaviors, and even minds over thousands of years. Flores is one of the clearest expressions of this rule, a place where evolution did not simply tweak species but radically transformed them. When scientists began studying Homo floresiensis, they quickly realized that the Hobbit was not alone in its smallness. The entire island was a gallery of miniaturized life, carved under the same relentless pressures of isolation. To understand why the Hobbits became so small, one must first understand the unique environment of Flores. Millions of years ago, the island sat far from any major continental landmass. No large predators roamed its forests, no abundance of prey grazed its valleys. Instead, Flores was defined by scarcity, limited resources, limited space, and limited migration. These constraints forced every creature that arrived to undergo a transformation. If a species remained too large, it risked starvation. If it reproduced too slowly, it risked being wiped out by natural disasters or sudden climatic shifts. The island favored only those who could live small, move lightly, and survive on little. This is why ancient elephants that reached Flores, towering giants on the mainland, eventually evolved into pygmy forms. Creatures like stegodon, once imposing members of a vast family of proboscideans, dwindled in size until they resembled large cows rather than monumental pachyderms. For thousands of years, these miniature elephants walked the same landscapes that the hobbits would later inhabit. They were among the dominant herbivores of the island, grazing in small herds, navigating narrow forest paths, and competing for every leaf and patch of grass. Their small stature was not a flaw but an evolutionary solution, a way to survive on an island that could not sustain giants. The same pattern repeated itself in other species. Rats, which are often small on the mainland, grew to enormous proportions on Flores, becoming some of the largest rodents in the region. Meanwhile, storks and other birds adjusted their size based on available resources, with some species becoming larger to fill ecological roles vacated by missing predators. It was a world turned upside down, where scale lost its familiar meaning, and life reorganized itself into a new hierarchy defined by island limitations. Into this environment stepped the ancestors of Homo floresiensis. Whether they were early Homo erectus or members of an even older lineage, their arrival placed them under the same evolutionary pressures that had sculpted the island's fauna. Large-bodied early humans would have quickly faced resource shortages. Hunting would have been difficult, and sustaining larger brains and heavier frames nearly impossible. Over thousands of generations, natural selection would have favored individuals who required fewer calories, occupied smaller ecological niches, and survived on less food. Slowly, bodies shrank. Brain size decreased. The species adapted to the island's demands, until the once tall human ancestors were transformed into a new form entirely. The process was not simply a matter of shrinking. The island rule can also produce unique anatomical shifts unrelated to size. Traits once advantageous might become unnecessary or even detrimental. Features that belonged to earlier ancestors may resurface in isolated populations, a phenomenon known as evolutionary reversal. This may explain why the hobbits displayed such a puzzling mix of primitive and advanced traits. On Flores, evolution did not follow the same path as on the mainland. It branched, twisted, and responded to pressures that did not exist elsewhere. The small brain of Homo floresiensis, for example, was not necessarily a sign of reduced intelligence. Brain shrinkage can occur in species that face limited energy supplies, and natural selection often retains the cognitive capabilities most essential for survival. The hobbits did not need the large, energy-demanding brains of Homo sapiens. They needed efficiency. They needed adaptability. And their tool use, evident in the sophisticated stone implements found in Liangbua, proved that they retained precisely the capabilities required. What makes the island rule even more remarkable is its consistency. Across the world, from Mediterranean islands to Southeast Asia, species isolated on small land masses have undergone similar transformations. Mammoths on Wrangel Island became dwarfs. Deer in the Philippines evolved into tiny forest dwellers. Even ancient hominins on other isolated islands may have experienced similar pressures. Flores, however, remains one of the most dramatic examples because it produced a small-bodied human species that survived tens of thousands of years, long after other human lineages had disappeared. The story of the Hobbits, then, is fundamentally a story of ecological constraint. Without predators to keep population sizes in check, without vast landscapes to roam, without seasonal abundance to rely on, evolution pushed them toward smallness. Every generation became a little more efficient, a little lighter on the land, a little more compatible with the island's limited offerings. The Hobbit was not a diminished version of humanity, it was a specialized one. It carried the marks of an evolutionary journey shaped by pressures most humans never faced. Yet Flores also reminds us that evolution is not always predictable. While many species shrank, others grew. The Komodo dragon, for example, became the apex predator of the island, reaching sizes far larger than its mainland relatives. In the absence of large mammals and competing predators, it evolved into a dominating carnivore. In this way, the island rule did not simply shrink life, it also magnified it in unexpected directions. This balance of miniature herbivores and oversized predators created a unique ecological tension, one that shaped the daily survival of Homo floresiensis. Ultimately, the island rule teaches us that evolution is context-dependent. Where modern humans evolved in large, interconnected environments with abundant resources, the Hobbits evolved in isolation, scarcity, and constraint. Their small size was not a weakness but a triumph, a testament to nature's ability to mold species into forms perfectly attuned to their environments. Flores did not merely host Homo floresiensis, it created them. The island itself was the sculptor, carving the Hobbit's form through pressures that lasted tens of thousands of years. And in that sculpting lies one of the most extraordinary chapters of human evolution, a reminder that the human story is not linear or uniform, but diverse, adaptable, and deeply intertwined with the landscapes that shaped us. Long before the Hobbits walked across Flores, long before their tiny footprints pressed into the volcanic soil, the island was home to creatures that defied the island rule. While many species shrank to survive, a few rose above the constraints of limited resources and isolation. These were the giants of Flores, remarkable, fearsome, and utterly unique. Their presence shaped the lives of every other species on the island, including Homo floresiensis. To understand the world the Hobbits inherited, one must first meet the giants who claimed Flores as their domain. Among the most iconic of these giants was the Komodo dragon, a descendant of ancient monitor lizards that once roamed Southeast Asia. On most islands, large predators struggle to maintain stable populations due to limited prey. But Flores offered the Komodo dragon something unusual: ecological opportunity. With no big cats, no wolves, and no bears to compete against, this giant reptile became the unchallenged apex predator. Over millennia, it grew larger and more powerful than its mainland relatives, reaching lengths of up to 3 meters, with muscular bodies, venomous saliva, and hunting strategies that blurred the line between reptilian instinct and intelligent cunning. To a species as small as Homo floresiensis, the Komodo dragon was more than a predator, it was a living force of nature. Imagine standing only 3 feet tall while a reptile more than twice your height watched quietly from the shadows. Its patience, its slow, deliberate movements, and its sudden bursts of speed would have made it a constant and terrifying presence. Every trek to gather food, every hunt, every movement through dense foliage carried the risk of encountering this giant. The Hobbits learned to survive not just in isolation, but under the reign of a hunter that dwarfed them in size and strength. But the Komodo dragon was not the only giant shaping Flores' prehistoric ecosystem. Towering storks, marabou-like birds that exceeded human height, strode across the plains and riverbanks. These colossal birds, with wingspans stretching wider than many human arm spans, preyed on small animals and scavenged carrion. Their size, again, defied the island rule. They flourished not because of abundant resources, but because the island lacked mammalian predators that would typically challenge such large birds. Their dominance filled a niche that, on the mainland, might have belonged to large cats or hyenas. To the hobbits, the giant storks would have been both threat and opportunity. Their eggs offered valuable nutrition, but their sharp beaks and towering height made them dangerous. A single blow could incapacitate or kill a small-bodied human. The hobbits had to navigate this balance, approaching cautiously, exploiting opportunities without provoking deadly retaliation. Some scientists even theorize that these storks may have preyed on hobbit children or incapacitated adults, just as they preyed on small mammals. The threat was real, and the hobbits lived their lives under its constant shadow. Beyond predators, Flores also hosted impressive herbivores like Stegodon, the dwarf elephant that played a central role in the island's ecology. Though miniaturized compared to its mainland relatives, Stegodon remained enormous from the hobbits' perspective. Standing nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, these creatures were powerful, heavy, and territorial. Their grazing patterns shaped the landscape, carving paths through dense vegetation and opening spaces for new plants to grow. For the hobbits, these giants were a part of daily life, sometimes a source of meat through scavenging or coordinated hunting, other times a hazard requiring distance and caution. The coexistence of tiny humans and oversized predators created a delicate ecological drama. While most animals adapted to limited resources by shrinking, predators like the Komodo dragon thrived precisely because everything else became smaller. Their prey became easier to catch. Their dominance became absolute. And Homo floresiensis, perched at the fragile edge of survival, had to develop strategies that balanced caution with ingenuity. Small stature may have made them vulnerable, but it also allowed them to move quietly, hide effectively, and navigate terrain where larger species struggled. The landscape itself was sculpted by these giants. Trails etched into the earth by Stegodon. Herds became the pathways that hobbits followed. Clearings formed by grazing became gathering sites and hunting grounds. The remains of Komodo kills attracted scavengers, including early humans who learned to identify safe times to approach abandoned carcasses. Flores was not merely a backdrop to the Hobbit story, it was an active, dynamic stage shaped by creatures both large and small. Over time, the presence of giants likely influenced the culture and behaviors of Homo floresiensis. From tool design to fire placement, from sleeping sites to social structures, everything had to account for threats that could strike swiftly and without warning. The hobbits may have developed lookout behaviors, nighttime vigilance, or group strategies to repel or avoid predators. They may have relied heavily on caves like Liang Bua not just as homes, but as sanctuaries, natural fortresses against the island's many dangers. The contrast between the giant predators and the miniature humans highlights one of the most fascinating aspects of Flores' prehistoric world. Size was not synonymous with dominance. The hobbits survived not through physical strength but through adaptability. Their small bodies conserved energy, allowed nimble movement, and made hiding easier. Evolution had shaped them for endurance in a world filled with scaled hunters, towering birds, and strange herbivores. They were tiny in form, but mighty in resilience. The giants of Flores eventually faded from the island's ecosystems, some through extinction, others through gradual decline as environments shifted. But their legacy endured in the bones left behind, in the landscapes they shaped, and in the evolutionary paths they influenced. When Homo floresiensis emerged, it did so within this intricate ecological framework, molded by the constant tension between predator and prey, small and large, danger and opportunity. In many ways, the giants were the silent architects of the Hobbit's world. Their presence forged the challenges that shaped Hobbit intelligence, cooperation, and survival strategies. They defined what it meant to be small in a land where size did not always bring advantage. As the story of Homo floresiensis unfolds, the giants of Flores stand as reminders that evolution does not act in isolation. It responds to the pressures, dangers, and opportunities created by every species living in the same fragile space. To understand the life of Homo floresiensis, one must first imagine the island of Flores as it existed tens of thousands of years ago, untamed, unpredictable, and profoundly isolated. This was a world shaped by geological upheaval and tropical climate, where volcanic peaks pierced the clouds and dense forests stretched across valleys like green oceans. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of wet earth, blooming flowers, and smoke from distant natural fires. It was an environment that felt both intimate and vast, a place where every living creature, big or small, had to adapt or perish. And in this rugged landscape, the Hobbit found its place, not through dominance, but through harmony with the land. Each morning, the island came alive with a chorus of sounds. Cicadas vibrated the air with their rhythmic hum, birds called from treetops high above, and unseen animals rustled through the undergrowth. The forests were dense enough that rays of sunlight filtered through in broken shards, illuminating patches of earth scattered with leaves, roots, and fallen branches. For a creature as small as Homo floresiensis, this world was both shelter and labyrinth. The foliage provided cover from predators, but it also demanded constant awareness. Every path, every bend, every shadow held the possibility of danger, or opportunity. The terrain of Flores was far from gentle. Sharp volcanic rocks jutted from the ground, rivers carved steep channels through the landscape, and sudden cliffs appeared between stretches of dense jungle. Navigating this environment required agility, nimbleness, and intimate knowledge of the land. For the Hobbit, whose body stood less than a meter tall, the island presented challenges uniquely scaled to its form. Fallen logs became barriers or bridges. Boulder fields became mazes. Tall grasses reached above their heads, turning open plains into walls of waving green. Yet these obstacles did not hinder them. In many ways, they shaped the Hobbit's daily rhythm. From the perspective of a 3-foot-tall human, the island felt immense. A short distance for modern humans could represent a long journey for them. Drinking water sources, fruit patches, hunting areas, and shelter locations had to be chosen carefully. Energy conservation was essential. But their small size also brought advantages. They could slip through gaps in the vegetation, climb uneven surfaces with ease, and hide in crevices too small for predators like the Komodo dragon. Their world was not built for towering figures, it was designed, over millennia, to match the proportions and needs of creatures adapted to island living. The climate of Flores added another layer of complexity. The island experienced intense rainy seasons, when downpours flooded the forests, transformed rivers into currents of brown rushing water, and triggered landslides that reshaped the terrain overnight. During the dry seasons, the land cracked, water became scarce, and food availability fluctuated dramatically. The Hobbits learned to navigate this cycle, shifting their foraging patterns, adjusting their movements, and relying on caves like Liang Bua as stable refuges during periods of environmental stress. Liang Bua, in particular, was more than a shelter, it was a constant in an unpredictable world. Its high ceilings, cool air, and stable interior temperature made it ideal for long-term habitation. During storms, the cave protected them from torrential rain. During heat waves, it offered shade and comfort. The cave's location near freshwater sources and fertile foraging grounds made it strategically significant. It was a base from which the Hobbits could explore, hunt, gather, and return safely. Its walls held echoes of their voices, their fires, and the countless moments that defined their lives. The vegetation of Flores played a central role in shaping the Hobbits' daily experience. The forests were dominated by towering trees whose roots twisted through the earth like giant serpents. Beneath these trees grew dense layers of shrubs, ferns, and vines. Fruit-bearing plants offered nourishment, but many were seasonal. Wild tubers and roots required digging and careful processing. Edible leaves and seeds were found in abundance only at certain times of the year. The hobbits likely learned to track these cycles, developing intimate knowledge of which plants thrived where, and when. This understanding was not merely practical, it was crucial for survival. The animals of the island added texture to the landscape. Small mammals scurried along the forest floor. Giant rats, large enough to be substantial prey, roamed in groups. Birds filled the canopy with their movements and calls. Every creature formed part of a delicate ecological network, one that the hobbit learned to participate in with precisely the right balance of aggression and caution. Their small body size allowed them to move quietly, observe their surroundings closely, and react swiftly to threats. They were not dominant hunters, but strategic ones. Fire, a tool that had spread across human species for hundreds of thousands of years, played a significant role in shaping the hobbits' interaction with their world. The ability to create and control fire allowed them to cook food, ward off predators, and illuminate dark spaces. At night, firelight flickered against the cave walls, casting shadows that danced like spirits from deeper eras. These flames may have served not only as protection, but as a focal point for social interaction. Around the fire, stories may have been shared, tools repaired, and food divided. In the vast and dark wilderness, fire was a symbol of their humanity. The hobbits' world was not static. Earthquakes shook the ground with sudden violence. Volcanic eruptions spewed ash into the sky, blanketing forests and altering habitats. These eruptions could devastate ecosystems in moments, forcing species to migrate, adapt, or perish. For Homo floresiensis, such events were both threats and opportunities. They cleared vegetation, exposed new areas for foraging, and shifted the movement patterns of prey. The hobbits survived these changes through flexibility, a hallmark of all human species. What made this world so remarkable was how everything, from climate to geography, from animals to plants, aligned to shape a specific way of life. The hobbit did not merely live in this environment, it became part of it. Its small body, its efficient movements, its adaptive behaviors were all expressions of an ancient conversation between species and landscape. Flores was not simply a setting, it was a sculptor, a teacher, and a challenge. A world built for small feet is a world that rewards awareness, patience, and resourcefulness. It is a world of narrow paths, hidden shelters, and quiet strategies. For Homo floresiensis, this world was not limiting, it was empowering. In its scale and complexity, the hobbit found a niche perfectly suited to its form, allowing it to flourish in ways no one could have imagined until its bones emerged from the depths of Liangbua. One of the most astonishing revelations about Homo floresiensis was not their tiny bones, nor their unexpected anatomy, but the tools scattered around their remains. These tools were sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably crafted with intention. They did not belong to a mind lost in primitive instinct. They reflected planning, skill, and a level of technological familiarity that seemed impossible for a species with a brain the size of a grapefruit. This contradiction, the small brain yet sophisticated behavior, became known as the toolkit paradox. It forced scientists to reconsider long-held assumptions about intelligence, cognition, and what it truly means to be human. The tools found in Liangbua cave were made primarily of stone, chiseled through techniques that required precision and understanding of fracture patterns. Flakes had been struck from larger stones to create sharp edges ideal for cutting meat or processing plant materials. Other tools bore signs of repeated use, wear marks, polished edges, and the telltale signs of controlled craftsmanship. These artifacts were not random accidents of nature, they were the result of deliberate action. To create tools like these, the hobbits needed more than dexterity, they needed foresight. Many of these tools resembled those associated with much larger-brained hominins across the world. The shapes echoed the stone technologies of Homo erectus, and in some cases approached the complexity of early Homo sapiens tools found elsewhere in Asia. This raised a startling question: how could such a small-brained hominin produce technology that mirrored species with nearly triple their brain volume? Scientists were confronted with a paradox that challenged the traditional correlation between brain size and cognitive capability. One explanation suggested that the hobbits inherited their tool-making knowledge from the ancestors who first arrived on Flores. If those ancestors were Homo erectus or another early technological species, then perhaps the techniques were culturally transmitted through generations. But cultural transmission alone could not fully explain the level of refinement seen in some tools. Skills tend to degrade over time without reinforcement, and isolated populations usually become more simplified in their toolkits, not more refined. Yet on Flores, the opposite seemed to have occurred. Even after thousands of years of isolation, the hobbits retained a tool-making tradition that remained effective and durable. Another perspective proposed that intelligence is not solely dependent on brain size, but on the internal organization of the brain. Perhaps the hobbits evolved neural efficiency, a compact brain wired for survival in their specific ecological niche. The structure of their brain may have allowed them to process information quickly and effectively despite its small volume. After all, many animals with small brains demonstrate remarkable problem-solving abilities. Birds, cephalopods, and even small mammals have shown advanced cognition without the massive brains humans possess. In this light, the hobbits might have achieved cognitive sophistication through evolutionary optimization rather than expansion. The tools also revealed insights into the daily lives of Homo floresiensis. Sharp flakes could cut through animal hide or butcher prey. Scrapers could clean bones, prepare skins, or shape wooden spears. Some tools suggested delicate tasks such as plant processing or fiber preparation, activities that reflected not just survival but adaptability. The presence of burned materials near some tools pointed toward cooking or controlled fire use, indicating that the hobbits were not merely passive scavengers but active participants in shaping their environment. Beyond practical function, the tools hinted at social behavior. Tool-making requires knowledge transfer. One individual observes another, learns the techniques, and replicates them. Over generations, a community maintains this knowledge through shared teaching and practice. This suggests that Homo floresiensis lived in social groups with communication methods sufficient for transmitting technological skills. Their small-brained ancestors, then, were not isolated individuals but members of communities where learning and cooperation were essential. The paradox deepened when researchers discovered older stone tools on Flores dating back hundreds of thousands of years, predating the earliest known hobbit fossils. These ancient tools implied that hominins had been on the island long before Homo floresiensis fully emerged. Whether these earlier toolmakers were direct ancestors or entirely separate species remains debated. But the continuity of stone tool technology suggested that Flores had a long history of human-like presence, one shaped by adaptation to the island's demanding environment. Critics of the Hobbit as toolmaker hypothesis initially proposed that modern humans created the tools and the hobbits merely inhabited the same cave at different times. But the stratigraphy, the layering of sediment, refuted this. The layers containing the hobbit remains and tools were distinct, consistent, and clearly ancient. There was no sign of intrusion by modern humans in those levels. The tools belonged to the same timeframe, the same context, the same species. Slowly, the world accepted that Homo floresiensis was indeed responsible for shaping these artifacts. The toolkit paradox compelled scientists to rethink the relationship between anatomy and intelligence. For decades, the dominant narrative in anthropology was that increasing brain size was the driving force behind human technological advancement. But here was evidence that evolution could take a different route, a more compact, efficient brain capable of similar outcomes. This challenged assumptions not only about the hobbit but about human evolution as a whole. If a tiny human species could craft tools, build fires, hunt cooperatively, and navigate a dangerous landscape full of predators and obstacles, then intelligence must be more flexible than previously believed. It raised questions about why modern humans evolved such large brains in the first place. Were our ancestors pushed into cognitive expansion due to environmental challenges that the hobbits never faced? Was our intelligence an evolutionary accident rather than destiny? Flores suggested that the human story might have unfolded differently in a different ecological setting. The toolkit paradox also served as a humbling reminder that our assumptions about superiority and capacity are often projections of our own biases. Intelligence is not a straight line from simple to complex. It is a web of adaptations shaped by survival needs, ecological pressures, and evolutionary chance. The hobbits, despite their small stature and small brains, thrived on Flores for tens of thousands of years, longer than many human species managed in other regions. Their tools were extensions of their resilience, evidence of a species that mastered its environment without the cognitive luxuries modern humans take for granted. In the dim fire-lit chambers of Liang Bua, stone tools lay beside bones, silent but eloquent witnesses to a paradox that reshaped our understanding of human capability. The hobbits may have been small, but their ingenuity left marks as enduring as any great human achievement. Their toolkit was not just a collection of stones, it was a testament to the adaptive brilliance that hides in unexpected corners of evolution. Night on Flores was not a gentle darkness. It was deep, alive, and filled with sounds that echoed through the forests like whispers from another age. In this world, where predators prowled silently and shadows stretched long beneath the moonlight, fire was more than a tool, it was survival, community, and identity. For Homo floresiensis, the firelight flickering within caves like Liang Bua marked the thin boundary between vulnerability and safety, between the unknown outside and the shared warmth within. Fire became the heartbeat of their nights, a silent guardian shaping their lives in ways both practical and deeply emotional. Archaeological traces of charcoal, burned bones, and heat-altered stones revealed that the hobbits controlled fire with deliberate intention. The fire pits discovered in the cave were not accidental burn marks or natural scorchings, they were built, maintained, and used regularly. To gather around a controlled flame meant the hobbits understood how to collect dry wood, how to ignite sparks, and how to maintain embers. These skills required patience, observation, and memory, qualities that speak to a capacity for forward planning, something once believed beyond the reach of such a small-brained species. Imagine the evenings they experienced. As the sky dimmed and the forest sounds intensified, the hobbits retreated to their safe havens. They gathered dry branches, leaves, and bark, their small hands working efficiently with tools shaped by stone. The first crackle of fire brought relief. The glow illuminated faces, cast long shadows on cave walls, and offered warmth that shielded them from the night's chill. Firelight softened the harshness of their environment, creating a pocket of peace in a world dominated by uncertainty. Fire did more than ward off predators, though that was a significant benefit. Komodo dragons, snakes, and large birds of prey kept their distance from flames. The light disrupted their hunting rhythms and the smoke masked human scent trails. For the hobbits, whose small size made them vulnerable, fire was a powerful ally. It expanded their safety zone, transforming the cave entrance into a barrier no predator wished to cross lightly. In this sense, fire played a vital evolutionary role, allowing small-bodied humans to survive in an ecosystem where they were not the strongest or the fastest. But fire also opened new opportunities for nourishment. Burned bones found in Liang Bua show signs of cooking, evidence that the hobbits used fire to roast meat, soften tubers, and process foods that would otherwise be indigestible or toxic. Cooking increased caloric intake, improved digestion, and allowed them to access nutrients crucial for survival. Even with their small brains and bodies, the benefits of cooked food supported their endurance and vitality. In many ways, fire acted as an external digestive system, giving them access to richer diets despite the limitations of island resources. The social significance of fire may have been even greater than its practical uses. Humans, regardless of species, have always gathered where warmth and light converge. Around the fire, the hobbits may have mended tools, shared food, and communicated in ways we cannot fully reconstruct but can imagine through the behaviors of other hominin species. Perhaps they used gestures, simple vocalizations, or rhythmic patterns to coordinate hunts or strengthen group bonds. The flames would have offered a focal point for these interactions, a shared center of activity that nurtured community and cooperation. The cave walls themselves may have reflected these gatherings, capturing movements and flickers of light that played out like ancient storytelling. While no cave paintings from the Hobbits have been discovered, the capacity for symbolic thought cannot be dismissed. Fire could have inspired rituals, meanings, or rhythms that echoed across generations. Even without formal art, the simple act of gathering in firelight forms a kind of cultural expression, a shared ritual passed down through time. In addition to community building, firelight extended the Hobbits' day beyond the setting sun. It allowed them to work, prepare food, and maintain tools after dark. In a world where daylight was precious and dangers lurked in every direction, the ability to harness light at night was transformative. It offered time, something often overlooked but essential for a species adapting to scarce resources and constant threats. Time gave them the chance to think, plan, collaborate, and strengthen their survival strategies. Fire also shaped the emotional experience of the Hobbits. The island, though beautiful, was unforgiving. Thunderstorms rolled in with sudden fury, earthquakes rattled the landscape, and volcanic ash occasionally darkened the sky. In such moments, fire provided comfort and familiarity. It offered a sense of continuity amid chaos, a symbol of stability in a world defined by unpredictability. Even modern humans find solace in fire's warmth and glow. For the Hobbits, whose world was more dangerous and uncertain, that comfort must have been profound. The power of fire extended beyond the cave. In open areas, controlled burns may have been used to clear pathways, flush out prey, or promote the growth of plants that attracted herbivores. Evidence from other hominin species shows that fire management evolved in different forms across the human lineage. It is entirely possible that Homo floresiensis developed its own small-scale versions, methods adapted to their size, tools, and environment. Even simple fire-based strategies could have dramatically influenced their interaction with the land. What makes this all the more remarkable is the contrast between their physical proportions and their fire-making abilities. A tiny body with a tiny brain, crafting tools, hunting animals, and maintaining fire, it defies expectation. Yet fire proves that intelligence is not always tied to size. It is tied to need, adaptation, and creativity. For Homo floresiensis, fire was not a luxury but a necessity. And necessity is one of evolution's most powerful teachers. As night gave way to dawn, the embers in Liang Bua's fire pits slowly faded. The Hobbits would emerge once more into the daylight, ready to face the challenges of their island home. But each night, they returned to the flames, guided by instincts both practical and emotional. Fire became a thread connecting past to future, survival to identity, fear to safety. In the dance of firelight on stone walls, one sees not just survival, but humanity in its most ancient and resilient form. In the end, the firelight of Flores tells a story far greater than heat or protection. It reveals a species that understood its world deeply, adapted brilliantly, and lived with a sense of community that transcended its size. It shows us that intelligence is not always loud or large, it can be small, quiet, and glowing in the darkness of a cave, where tiny humans once gathered around flames that kept the night at bay. The discovery of Homo floresiensis sparked one of the most difficult and fascinating questions in human evolution: where did the Hobbits come from? Their tiny bodies, their mosaic of primitive and modern traits, and their isolated existence on Flores all pointed to an ancestry unlike anything scientists had previously encountered. As researchers examined their bones, they realized that the Hobbit could not be neatly placed on the traditional human family tree. Instead, it cast a long, enigmatic shadow, one that stretched back hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years. At first glance, many believed the Hobbit had descended from Homo erectus. After all, Homo erectus was known to have spread across Asia long before the Hobbits appeared. The species possessed advanced tool-making skills, upright walking, and a robust body, all traits one might expect in an ancestor capable of reaching an isolated island like Flores. If erectus individuals had been swept onto the island during storms or rafting events, they would have found themselves in an environment uniquely suited to insular dwarfism. Over generations, they could have shrunk, adapted, and evolved into the tiny humans found in Liangbua. This hypothesis seemed logical, but cracks began to appear. Some anatomical features of the Hobbit were too primitive, even more ancient than those of Homo erectus. Their wrist structure, shoulder alignment, and foot proportions resembled those of Homo habilis or even Australopithecines from Africa. These traits should have disappeared millions of years before the age of the Hobbits. How could they suddenly reappear in a population supposedly descended from erectus? Evolution rarely reverses complex traits, and such a scenario seemed unlikely unless natural selection had driven the species back toward earlier anatomical forms. This led to a more astonishing possibility. What if the ancestors of Homo floresiensis arrived on Flores long before Homo erectus ever spread widely through Asia? Some researchers argued that an even earlier hominin, something closer to habilis, might have left Africa far earlier than previously believed. Such a migration had little supporting evidence, but the Hobbit's anatomy forced scientists to reconsider the timeline. If an ancient, small-bodied hominin reached Flores by accident, isolation could have preserved and modified its primitive traits, producing a species far removed from anything known on the mainland. The idea of a habilis-like ancestor traveling thousands of kilometers across oceans or land bridges seemed far-fetched, yet the Hobbits themselves were proof that evolution sometimes takes improbable turns. Their presence on Flores demanded an explanation, and the traditional model, Africa to Asia to Flores, no longer seemed sufficient. The ancestral shadow grew longer, its edges blurred by the limits of fossil evidence. Another theory emerged: perhaps the Hobbits were not direct descendants of any known species. Instead, they might represent an evolutionary branch that split off early in human history and developed independently in Southeast Asia. This would make them part of a parallel human lineage rather than a miniature version of erectus or habilis. The diversity of ancient humans was far greater than once believed, with species like Homo luzonensis and denisovans emerging as new branches. The Hobbit might simply be another lost leaf on the vast evolutionary tree, one that survived in isolation long after its relatives vanished elsewhere. Yet the deeper scientists explored, the more contradictions arose. The Hobbit's brain was extremely small, smaller even than that of Homo habilis, but its cognitive capabilities, as demonstrated by tool use, were surprisingly advanced. This raised questions about whether their small brain evolved gradually on Flores or whether their ancestors were already small-brained before arriving. If the latter, the Hobbit lineage might extend back to a time when multiple hominin species roamed the world, some of which left no fossils we have yet found. Dating the remains further complicated the story. Evidence suggested that Homo floresiensis lived as recently as 50,000 years ago, overlapping with modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. If the Hobbits had such ancient origins, how did they survive in isolation for so long when other species went extinct? What environmental or evolutionary conditions allowed them to persist while more advanced humans disappeared across continents? The question of their ancestry became not just a biological puzzle but a philosophical one. The Hobbit challenged the notion that human evolution followed a simple, upward trajectory toward bigger brains and more complex behaviors. Instead, it suggested that multiple solutions to survival existed, some small, some large, some sophisticated, others efficient. The Hobbit's ancestor, whoever it was, embodied the idea that evolution is not linear but branching, chaotic, and often unpredictable. As new fossils surfaced, including jaw fragments, teeth, and limb bones, the debate intensified. Some pieces supported the erectus descendant theory, others leaned toward a more ancient origin. No single explanation fit all the evidence. It was as if the Hobbit's lineage was intentionally shrouded in mystery, daring researchers to look deeper into the gaps in the fossil record. The truth might lie in a species not yet discovered or in a migration event long erased by time and sea. Even today, scientists remain divided. Some believe the Hobbit descended from a small-bodied, early Homo species. Others argue for a microevolved erectus population. A few insist the Hobbit represents a wholly unique branch, a lineage unlike anything else found in Asia. What unites them all is the recognition that Homo floresiensis rewrote what we thought we knew about the human story. In the dim corridors of Liang Bua, where stone tools and bones rest silently, the shadows of ancestors linger. They hint at a journey across oceans or forests, a transformation shaped by isolation, and an evolutionary path unlike any other. The Hobbit may never reveal its full origin, but its existence expands our understanding of what humanity can be. In their tiny bones lies a reminder that our family tree is vast, unexpected, and filled with branches still hidden in the shadows of deep time. Long before Homo floresiensis walked the forests of Flores, before their tiny footprints marked the soil and their tools clinked against stone, their ancestors faced a journey so improbable that it borders on the miraculous. Flores has never been connected to any major landmass, not even during the lowest sea levels of the ice ages. That means one undeniable truth: whoever first reached Flores had to cross the sea. This revelation forces us to imagine a world where ancient hominins, smaller-brained, early humans, looked out across rolling waves and unknowingly stepped into one of the greatest accidental voyages in evolutionary history. The ancestors of the Hobbits may not have set out with the intention of discovering new lands. Their journey was likely born from chaos rather than choice. Massive storms, tsunamis, and violent shifts in weather could have torn chunks of vegetation from coastlines, creating natural rafts filled with tangled roots, branches, and drifting debris. Early hominins living along coastal forests in Southeast Asia may have been swept onto these floating islands during storms, forced to cling to survival as ocean currents pushed them into the unknown. Whether a single group or multiple waves, this accidental rafting event marks one of the earliest and most astonishing dispersals of hominins across open water. Yet even accidental voyages require survival skills. These early travelers, possibly Homo erectus or an even older species, would have endured days or weeks adrift, exposed to sun, rain, hunger, and fear. Some would have perished. But those who survived washed ashore on Flores, exhausted, disoriented, but alive. To step onto a volcanic island filled with strange animals, dense forests, and unfamiliar environments must have been terrifying. But it also marked a moment that would alter the course of human evolution. These survivors became the founders of a lineage that would remain isolated for hundreds of thousands of years. There is another possibility, one even more astonishing: early humans may have possessed rudimentary seafaring awareness. Though difficult to prove, some researchers propose that ancient hominins could have intentionally rafted, using fallen logs or simple structures to drift from island to island. Stone tools found on neighboring islands suggest that humans or prehumans had already crossed waterways long before reaching Flores. If this theory holds true, it implies that the ancestors of the Hobbits had a basic understanding of water travel, enough to exploit ocean currents for migration or exploration. Whichever scenario is true, the arrival of early hominins on Flores demonstrates a level of resilience and adaptability that scientists once believed impossible for small-brained species. The island they encountered was wild and unpredictable. Towering volcanic cliffs dominated the landscape. Coastal mangroves teemed with unfamiliar predators. Inland, forests hid creatures that would challenge even resourceful hominins: giant storks, enormous rats, and dangerous reptiles. But for the founders of the Hobbit lineage, these challenges became the backdrop of a new evolutionary chapter. The first settlers likely clung to coastal zones at first, relying on marine resources such as mollusks, fish, and crustaceans. These easily accessible food sources would have provided a stable foundation for survival. Over time, as populations grew and territories expanded, the early hominins pushed inland, exploring rivers, forests, and mountainous regions. Each movement farther into the island shaped their adaptation, shifting body size, altering diets, and transforming survival strategies. As generations passed, the isolation of Flores began to exert its influence. With no connection to mainland populations, these early humans had no genetic exchange with other hominin groups. Evolution acted slowly and strictly within the confines of the island's resources. The large-bodied ancestors that first arrived found themselves in an ecosystem that favored smaller size, lower energy requirements, and efficient use of food. Over tens of thousands of years, these pressures sculpted a new form of humanity, Homo floresiensis, whose small stature was not a weakness but a finely tuned response to environmental constraints. The voyage to Flores also raises deep questions about the capacity for early humans to survive extreme circumstances. Their journey across open sea was not a smooth migration but a trial by nature. To endure it required not only physical resilience but also social cooperation. Survival on a natural raft or coastal settlement demanded teamwork, sharing food, comforting infants, and navigating new surroundings. These behaviors reveal a social complexity often underestimated in early humans. Even if driven by instinct rather than intention, their collective adaptability made the impossible voyage possible. The arrival event also reshaped the island's ecosystem. Before humans arrived, the fauna of Flores existed in a delicate balance. The introduction of a new predator, one capable of crafting tools, hunting strategically, and manipulating fire, disrupted this equilibrium. Small mammals became new prey targets. Vegetation patterns changed as early humans foraged and cleared areas. Predators like Komodo dragons adapted to the presence of these newcomers, observing their behaviors, learning their weaknesses, and serving as rivals in the struggle for dominance. The ancestors of the Hobbits altered Flores, and in turn, Flores altered them. What makes the voyage of the first islanders so compelling is its fragility. A single failed crossing would have erased the possibility of Homo floresiensis entirely. A single storm striking at the wrong time could have wiped out the early settlers. A single shift in ecology could have prevented their survival. Yet through a combination of luck, resilience, and adaptation, they endured. Their journey stands as a testament to the unpredictable nature of evolution, how chance events can give rise to entirely new forms of life. As scientists continue to study the origins of the Hobbits, they look not only at the bones found in Liangbua but also at the histories preserved in ocean currents, coastal geology, and ancient climates. These clues point toward a past where hominins were not confined by land but shaped by the restless sea. The ancestors of the Hobbits did not simply walk into a new world, they were carried there, thrust into an environment that demanded transformation. In the end, the voyage of the first islanders is more than a migration story. It is a symbol of human resilience in its earliest forms, a reminder that even our small-brained ancestors possessed a spark of adaptability that allowed them to survive the unimaginable. Their journey across the waves set in motion the creation of a species unlike any other, a species that would remain hidden from the world for tens of thousands of years, waiting in the depths of Flores to be rediscovered. This voyage was the first chapter in the Hobbits' epic saga, one written not on land, but on the sea that carried their ancestors toward destiny. Evolution does not happen in moments. It unfolds in whispers, subtle shifts across thousands of generations, changes so gradual that no individual notices them but so profound that they reshape an entire species. On the island of Flores, this slow sculpting of time worked with relentless patience. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis arrived as ordinary hominins, perhaps resembling early Homo erectus or an even older lineage. But once marooned on their isolated volcanic world, they stepped into an evolutionary pressure cooker where every resource, every challenge, and every advantage shaped their bodies and minds. Over countless millennia, nature reshaped them into the tiny, resilient beings later discovered in Liangbua. When the first hominins settled on Flores, they encountered an ecosystem dramatically different from the mainland landscapes they once knew. Large predators were absent, but new dangers emerged in the form of giant reptiles and territorial birds. Food sources were limited, seasonal, and scattered. The island's rugged terrain demanded agility rather than strength, efficiency rather than size. In this environment, being small was not a disadvantage, it was a survival strategy. Large bodies required more calories, more mobility, more resources that Flores could not consistently provide. Smaller individuals likely fared better, survived longer, and passed on their genes. Over generations, natural selection shifted the population toward smaller statures, creating the foundation for a species adapted to scarcity. But dwarfing alone cannot explain the full transformation of the hobbits. While their bodies shrank, their anatomy morphed in ways that reflected deeper evolutionary forces. The shape of their feet changed, giving them long, flat structures better suited for navigating uneven volcanic terrain. Their arms and shoulders maintained more primitive forms, perhaps reflecting a past when their ancestors climbed or maneuvered through dense forests. Their brains, too, became smaller, yet not in a uniform or simplistic way. Instead of shrinking blindly, the brain reorganized itself to maintain essential cognitive functions, plan-making, tool crafting, navigation, and social cooperation, within a more compact structure. This process of fine-tuned adaptation demonstrates that evolution is not simply about losing traits but reallocating energy where it matters most. For a species living in an environment where survival was a delicate balance, conserving calories was vital. A smaller brain consumed fewer resources while still supporting behaviors necessary for survival. The hobbits did not become less intelligent, they became more efficient. They learned to maximize output from minimal biological input, a strategy that served them well for tens of thousands of years. The slow sculpting of time also left its imprint on their daily lives. Their smaller bodies meant they could move quietly through dense foliage, hide more effectively from predators, and navigate caves with ease. Their small size reduced risks associated with injuries and falls in a rugged environment filled with cliffs, sharp rocks, and dense roots. It also lowered the chances of catastrophic food shortages during harsh seasons. What would have been a life-threatening scarcity for larger hominins became manageable for the hobbit-sized population. The island itself acted as an evolutionary funnel, filtering which traits survived and which disappeared. Without competition from other human species, the hobbits developed in isolation, free from external pressures that shaped humans elsewhere. There was no need for taller bodies to intimidate rivals or larger brains to build complex societies. What mattered was the ability to endure the island's cycles of drought, storms, volcanic eruptions, and ecological fluctuations. The hobbits became specialists in island living, masters of adaptation in a narrow ecological niche. Environmental instability further accelerated their evolution. Flores was geologically active, with frequent earthquakes and eruptions. These dramatic events would have periodically devastated local habitats, killing off less adaptable individuals and forcing survivors into new landscapes and resource patterns. Such cycles created bursts of selective pressure, pushing the hobbit lineage down unique evolutionary pathways. Adaptability, flexibility, and small-scale resilience became essential. Over generations, these traits crystallized into a species perfectly molded for Flores. Another factor in their evolution was social structure. While we cannot reconstruct their full social behaviors, evidence of shared tools, communal hearths, and collective living spaces suggests that the hobbits lived in groups. Social species often develop traits that support cooperation and mutual survival. Over time, these social strategies may have further shaped their bodies and minds, reinforcing their ability to thrive without the complexity or energy demands seen in larger human societies. The slow sculpting of time also preserved primitive features in the hobbits that had long vanished from other human species. Their wrist bones resembled those of early hominins, implying an evolutionary retention rather than regression. Their feet and lower limbs hinted at ancestral forms more suited to climbing or uneven terrain. These retained traits suggest that once the ancestors of the hobbits arrived on Flores, evolution took a path distinct from the main human lineage. Their bodies were shaped not by competition with other hominins but by the unique pressures of the island ecosystem. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their evolution is how long it endured. While many human species rose and fell within relatively short spans of time, the hobbits occupied Flores for tens of thousands of years, possibly hundreds of thousands. This longevity speaks not only to their adaptability but to the stability of their evolutionary strategy. They were not transitional forms, they were a successful, enduring species shaped perfectly by their environment. Their story challenges the assumption that evolution always favors growth, complexity, and expansion. In the case of the hobbits, survival depended on the opposite, conserving energy, minimizing size, and becoming intricately attuned to a small and isolated world. Flores became their universe, and time became the artist that molded them. The slow sculpting of time did not merely shrink a species, it crafted a new form of humanity. One that defied expectations, expanded our understanding of evolution, and reminded us that survival has many shapes, some large and powerful, others tiny and resilient. On Flores, evolution whispered patiently, and from those whispers emerged the remarkable beings we now call Homo floresiensis. Life on Flores was a delicate dance between predator and prey, and Homo floresiensis occupied a unique place in this ancient theater. Though they were humans, they were not the dominant force on the island. Their small size placed them in a precarious middle tier, predators to some creatures, yet potential prey to others. Every day the hobbits stepped into a landscape where survival depended on keen senses, cooperative strategies, and an unwavering awareness of the dangers lurking beyond every shadow. In this ecosystem, they played both roles, the hunters and the hunted. Hunting for the hobbits was not an act of dominance but of necessity. The island offered limited protein sources, and the hobbits needed meat to supplement their foraging diets of plants, fruits, roots, and insects. Giant rats, some as large as small dogs, became one of their main targets. These rodents, abundant in the forests and grasslands of Flores, were agile, fast, and territorial. To bring them down, the hobbits likely required coordinated strategies. They may have set traps using sharpened sticks, dug concealed pits, or driven prey into confined spaces where group members ambushed them. Their stone tools, sharp and simple, were perfect for butchering meat, scraping hides, and breaking bones to access marrow. Stegodon, the dwarf elephant of Flores, was another central figure in the hobbits' world. Though smaller than mainland elephants, Stegodon still dwarfed the hobbits in every sense. It is unlikely that the hobbits actively hunted adult stegodons, they were far too large and dangerous. Instead, the hobbits probably scavenged carcasses left by natural deaths, falls, or predator attacks. A fallen stegodon could feed an entire hobbit community for days, drawing them together in coordinated but cautious efforts to cut meat and crack bones while keeping watch for hungry predators drawn by the scent. In rare situations, the hobbits may have targeted young or weakened individuals, using persistence hunting or fire to trap them, though such feats would have been risky and demanding. But while the hobbits hunted some creatures, they were hunted by others. The Komodo dragon was the most formidable danger they faced. A fully grown dragon could reach 3 meters in length, its bite laced with venom and bacteria capable of weakening prey through infection and blood loss. Komodo dragons ambushed silently, blending into vegetation until the moment they struck. For the hobbits, a single misstep could mean death. They had to learn the patterns of these predators, the paths they patrolled, the times of day they were most active, and the signs of their presence. The hobbits likely used fire, noise, and group cohesion as defensive strategies. Staying close to caves at night, particularly Liangbua, provided refuge from these fearsome hunters. Giant storks, too, played a role in shaping the hobbits' defensive behaviors. Though storks today mainly feed on fish and small animals, their prehistoric relatives on Flores were capable of more aggressive predatory behavior. Their height, sharp beaks, and keen eyesight would have made hobbit infants and small juveniles vulnerable targets. These birds may have patrolled open areas, forcing the hobbits to move cautiously through grasslands and avoid exposed landscapes. A mother hobbit might have needed to keep her children close, moving swiftly and quietly while foraging to avoid drawing the attention of these towering hunters. Even snakes, crocodiles, and other reptiles contributed to the dangers of daily life. The hobbits lived in a world where anything larger, faster, or more powerful could become a threat. Their survival required constant vigilance. Yet being small also gave them distinct advantages. They could move quietly through dense vegetation, hide effectively in narrow crevices or behind rock formations, and navigate terrain that was difficult for massive predators to enter. Their agility, combined with social cooperation, became essential tools in avoiding predation. The hobbits' role as hunters required equal adaptability. Tracking animals in the dense forest demanded acute observation. Footprints, droppings, broken branches, and disturbed leaves all served as clues. The hobbits would have learned these signs through experience and shared knowledge, passing on essential skills from one generation to the next. The presence of multiple stone tool types, choppers, scrapers, flakes, suggests a division of labor or specialized roles within groups. Some individuals may have focused on sharpening tools, others on butchering prey, and others on scouting or tracking. Even simple tasks required coordination and communication. The environment itself shaped their hunting techniques. Rivers and streams attracted both prey and predators, creating zones of opportunity and danger. Forest clearings became ambush sites. Rocky areas offered lookout points. Over time, the hobbits developed mental maps of their island, routes that maximized safety and opportunities, areas to avoid, and landmarks that guided their movements. Their deep familiarity with Flores made them efficient hunters despite their small size and simple tools. At dusk, the island transformed. Predators became more active, and shadows deepened into traps. This was when the hobbits shifted from hunters to the hunted most intensely. As night fell, they retreated into the security of caves or high ground. Fire pits were tended carefully. The flicker of flames cast an invisible perimeter of safety, discouraging dragons and other predators from coming too close. The hobbits may have taken turns keeping watch through the night, listening for rustles, growls, or the heavy footsteps of approaching danger. This daily cycle forged a species that existed in perfect balance with its environment. The hobbits were neither helpless prey nor dominant hunters, they were strategists, opportunists, and survivors. Their ability to navigate both roles shaped their evolution, their social structures, and their culture. In every decision, where to sleep, when to forage, whom to travel with, the balance between hunting and avoiding being hunted played a central role. What emerges from this dynamic is a portrait of resilience. The hobbits lived for tens of thousands of years in an environment modern humans would find overwhelming. They adapted not through brute strength or advanced technology but through cooperation, awareness, and flexible thinking. The duality of their existence as both hunters and hunted shaped them into a species both fragile and formidable. Their story reminds us that survival often depends not on dominance, but on harmony with the forces that surround us. In this delicate balance, the hobbits carved out their place in the world, a small but enduring presence on an island where every creature had to fight, hide, and adapt. Their legacy is written not only in bones and tools but in the invisible threads of strategy and instinct that defined their daily struggle. Flores was never a quiet island. Beneath its lush forests and peaceful waterways lay a restless geological heart, a world shaped by fire, ash, and the unpredictable rumblings of the earth. For Homo floresiensis, this environment was both home and hazard, a place of beauty shadowed by danger. Among all the forces shaping their world, none were as dramatic or transformative as the volcanic eruptions and climate shifts that periodically shook the island. And at the center of this turbulent landscape stood Liangbua, the cave that would one day preserve their story. When lightning split the sky and the earth trembled beneath their feet, the hobbits faced the full power of nature, a power that sculpted both their lives and their extinction. The volcanic nature of Flores was impossible to ignore. The island is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, a chain of active volcanoes stretching across oceans. Even today, the land bears scars of ancient eruptions, hardened lava flows, ash layers buried beneath soil, and craters filled with blue, still water. For the Hobbits, these eruptions were not relics of the past but events they lived through. The ash layers discovered within Liang Bua reveal that powerful eruptions occurred during their occupation of the cave. These eruptions sent plumes of ash into the sky, darkening daylight, choking the air, and coating the forest in a layer of dust that transformed the landscape overnight. Imagine the horizon turning ominously orange as volcanic smoke rises, drifting across the island like a living cloud. Animals flee in instinctual panic, birds scatter from treetops, and the hobbits gather near the cave entrance, watching the approaching darkness. The heat in the air intensifies, and the ground shakes in deep, rhythmic pulses. In moments like this, Liang Bua became more than a shelter, it became a fortress of stone, a sanctuary against forces far beyond the hobbits' control. These eruptions did more than frighten. They reshaped ecosystems. Layers of ash buried plants, rendering food sources scarce. Small mammals, unable to breathe or find shelter, perished in large numbers. Even the dwarf stegodon, one of the most resilient megafauna on Flores, suffered declines whenever volcanic events disrupted vegetation. For the hobbits, who depended on a delicate balance of prey and edible plants, these environmental shocks would have been devastating. Food shortages forced them to travel farther, risk new terrains, and compete more intensely for dwindling resources. Lightning storms accompanied many of these volcanic periods, adding further layers of danger and intensity. Flores' steep mountains and humid atmosphere created conditions ripe for electrical storms that sliced the night sky with blinding flashes. The hobbits, small and vulnerable, would have huddled in their caves as thunder roared through the valleys like the bellowing of ancient spirits. These storms, terrifying as they were, also ignited forest fires that transformed the land. In the aftermath, new growth sprouted, attracting herbivores and creating fresh opportunities for hunting. But the most profound environmental shifts came not from singular eruptions or storms, but from long-term climate cycles. Over tens of thousands of years, Flores experienced fluctuations in rainfall, temperature, and vegetation cover. Wet periods allowed forests to expand and thrive, while dry periods shrank them, creating patchy grasslands. Each shift altered the distribution of food, water, and shelter. The hobbits had to adapt constantly, adjusting their foraging patterns, migration routes, and settlement choices. During drier periods, freshwater sources dwindled, forcing the hobbits to rely more heavily on caves like Liang Bua, which often preserved pools or dripping water long after rivers ran dry. During wetter times, the surrounding forests grew dense and lush, offering abundant fruits, roots, and insect life. These fluctuations created cycles of abundance and scarcity that shaped the rhythm of hobbit life, periods of plenty followed by periods of desperation. Volcanic eruptions also brought new opportunities, despite the destruction they caused. Ash layers acted as natural fertilizers. Within months, new plants sprouted across the landscape, attracting animals and creating temporary booms in biodiversity. The hobbits, skilled observers of their environment, would have recognized these cycles and planned accordingly. Their survival required anticipating shifts, understanding patterns, and adjusting behaviors long before resources became critically limited. Yet even with all their adaptability, there were moments when nature was simply overwhelming. Major eruptions blanketed the island in meters of ash, collapsing habitats and triggering long-term ecological decline. One such event around 50,000 years ago appears to coincide with the disappearance of several key species, stegodon, giant storks, and other animals that formed the foundation of the hobbit survival system. As these species vanished, the entire food web began to collapse, leaving the hobbits in a precarious and shrinking niche. Some researchers believe that one catastrophic eruption may have been the turning point that the hobbits could not overcome. Without their primary prey and foraging cycles thrown into disarray, they faced starvation. Their already small population, vulnerable to genetic bottlenecks and inbreeding, may have dwindled rapidly. In this scenario, nature did not extinguish them with a single blow, but through a relentless combination of environmental challenges, each eruption, each storm, each shift in climate chipping away at their fragile existence. Liang Bua itself holds evidence of these transitions. The cave sediments record layers of ash, changes in soil composition, and gaps in occupation, periods where the hobbits may have temporarily abandoned the cave due to extreme conditions. When they returned, they found a changed world, one where new paths had to be forged and old strategies no longer worked. There is also the haunting possibility that volcanic changes coincided with the arrival of modern humans on nearby islands. As the hobbits struggled to survive environmental collapse, competitors with more advanced technologies may have entered the region, further straining their dwindling resources. Whether through indirect competition or environmental displacement, the timing suggests a moment where natural and human forces converged, a convergence the hobbits could not withstand. Lightning over Liang Bua symbolizes more than storms or eruptions. It represents the volatile relationship between nature and the small humans who called Flores home. It captures the moments when the sky lit up with danger, when ash rained from above, when survival demanded resilience beyond imagination. It tells the story of a species shaped as much by destruction as by creation. In the end, nature sculpted the fate of Homo floresiensis with the same slow, persistent forces that once created them. The island that sustained them was also the island that challenged them relentlessly. And as the storms rolled across the mountains and lightning flashed over Liang Bua, the hobbits faced their world with the courage of a species forged in fire, darkness, and the endless shifting rhythms of the earth. By the time Homo floresiensis entered their final chapters, Flores had already changed countless times around them. Forests shifted, rivers carved new paths, volcanic ash fell like curtains across the land, and the animals they depended on began to fade from the ecosystem. For tens of thousands of years, the hobbits adapted to every shift with remarkable resilience. But even the most adaptable species can reach a breaking point. The last age of the hobbits was not marked by a single disaster or dramatic moment, it was a slow and quiet unraveling, the gradual tightening of environmental pressures that eventually became impossible to survive. One of the first signs of decline was the disappearance of Stegodon, the dwarf elephant that had played a central role in the island's ecological balance. Stegodons were more than prey, they were ecosystem engineers. As they moved across the forests and grasslands, they shaped vegetation, created open pathways, and influenced the distribution of plant life. When stegodons vanished, the environment shifted in profound ways. Dense forests began to encroach on open areas. Shrubs and smaller plants grew unchecked. The hobbits lost a key food source, but they also lost the ecological patterns that had structured their world for thousands of years. The reasons for stegodons' extinction remain debated. Volcanic eruptions, climate change, and habitat shifts all likely contributed. Without their primary prey and scavenging opportunities, the hobbits were forced to rely more heavily on smaller animals, giant rats, birds, and reptiles. But these creatures provided far fewer calories. The hobbits needed to hunt more often, travel farther, and expend more energy at a time when resources were increasingly scarce. Their survival strategies stretched thinner with each passing generation. Climate fluctuations added further strain. Dry periods became harsher, wet seasons less predictable. Water sources dried up, forcing the hobbits to move between dwindling streams and caves. Vegetation cycles that once offered reliable fruits, roots, and edible plants became irregular. The hobbits, already living at the edge of sustainability due to their island's limitations, now faced conditions that challenged even their efficient, small-bodied physiology. As their resources dwindled, their population size likely shrank as well. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to genetic bottlenecks, a reduction in genetic diversity that weakens the resilience of future generations. Health issues, reduced fertility, and susceptibility to disease become more likely. For a species already surviving in a narrow ecological niche, even minor disruptions could have major consequences. Over time, the hobbits may have found it increasingly difficult to maintain stable group sizes, making cooperation, hunting, and reproduction more challenging. Some researchers propose that the arrival of Homo sapiens in nearby regions played a role in the hobbits' decline. While direct contact has not been proven, the presence of modern humans in Southeast Asia around the same time would have put indirect pressure on the hobbits. Humans could have hunted similar species, altered landscapes through fire or resource use, or introduced new competition into an already fragile ecosystem. Even the mere presence of humans on nearby islands may have shifted regional ecological dynamics in ways that indirectly impacted Flores. Yet the most haunting aspect of the Hobbit's final age is how quietly it seems to have unfolded. Unlike some extinction events marked by sudden catastrophe, the disappearance of Homo floresiensis appears slow and dispersed. There is no evidence of violent conflict, no mass die-off in a single layer of sediment, no sudden drop in population markers. Instead, occupation layers in Liang Bua gradually thin out. Tools become less frequent. Hearths appear less often. Over time, the sediments tell a story of absence, a story where the presence of the hobbits slowly fades like the dimming glow of embers after a fire. Imagine the final generations. A small band of hobbits, perhaps fewer than a dozen, living in a world where the forest feels too dense, the prey too elusive, the storms too unpredictable. They gather around the fire in Liang Bua, but the group is smaller than it used to be. Some members have died from illness or injury. Others have wandered off in search of food and not returned. The remaining few carry the last memories of their kind, knowledge of trails, trees, dangers, and stories that will vanish when they do. The emotional dimension of their final days is difficult to imagine but impossible to ignore. All human species, no matter how different in size or form, experienced pain, fear, and social bonds. The last hobbits likely felt the loss of companions, the weight of dwindling resources, and the quiet anxiety of a world that no longer sustained them as it once did. Their adaptability, their ingenuity, and their deep connection to Flores had allowed them to thrive for ages. But now even their hard-earned skills could no longer protect them from ecological collapse. Their extinction is a reminder that evolution is not a ladder but a story of survival against impossible odds. The hobbits were not primitive failures, they were successful specialists who endured in isolation for far longer than many human species. Their disappearance reflects the fragile balance of island ecosystems, where even small shifts can send ripple effects through every level of life. As the last age came to its final moments, Flores returned to silence. The caves no longer echoed with hobbit voices, the forests no longer felt the soft patter of their feet, and the fire pits grew cold. The island continued its restless cycle of eruptions, storms, and regrowth, but the tiny humans who had once navigated its challenges were gone. Their story lay buried beneath layers of sediment, waiting for curious minds thousands of years later to uncover the traces of their remarkable existence. The ending of Homo floresiensis was not a dramatic collapse but a quiet fading, a gradual disappearance into the deep rhythms of nature. And in this gentle exit lies one of prehistory's most profound lessons: even the most resilient species can vanish, not because they fail, but because the world around them shifts in ways too great to overcome. For tens of thousands of years, Homo floresiensis lived in isolation, shaped only by the island of Flores and the forces of nature. But isolation is never guaranteed forever. Across the broader world, another species was spreading, taller, stronger, and armed with technologies far beyond anything the hobbits possessed. This species was Homo sapiens, modern humans, whose journey out of Africa carried them into every corner of the world. The question that haunts the story of Homo floresiensis is simple yet profound: did the hobbits ever meet their tall cousins? The archaeological record offers no direct proof of contact, no unmistakable marks of conflict or coexistence. Yet the timing of events is striking. Modern humans arrived in Southeast Asia roughly 50,000 years ago, the same period during which the Hobbits vanished from Flores. This overlap suggests the possibility of encounters, whether brief and accidental or repeated and influential. To imagine these meetings is to imagine a moment unlike any in human history, two species of human, so different in size and form, standing face to face. Picture a group of modern humans arriving on a distant island after a long sea crossing, exhausted but driven by exploration. They step ashore, towering individuals nearly twice the height of the island's native inhabitants. The forest is thick, the air heavy, the land unfamiliar. As they travel inland, following game trails or searching for water, they might stumble upon footprints, small, bare tracks no larger than those of a toddler. But these prints are too well-formed, too consistent, belonging clearly to adults. Confusion would ripple through the group. Curiosity would follow. For the Hobbits, the arrival of modern humans would have been equally bewildering. They had never seen a creature like us, tall, upright humans with long limbs, expressive faces, and complex behaviors. To them, modern humans may have seemed like giants or spirits descending from distant worlds. The Hobbits were accustomed to giant birds and reptiles, but these new beings looked eerily familiar. Like themselves, they walked upright. Like themselves, they carried tools. But their size, their voices, and their movements must have seemed overwhelming. If the two species encountered each other, the first reactions could have ranged from fear to curiosity. Modern humans, depending on their mindset, might have viewed the Hobbits as some form of strange animal, a missing link, or even a mythical forest creature. The Hobbits, cautious and small, would likely have kept their distance, studying the newcomers from hiding places within the dense vegetation or cave entrances. The Komodo dragons, storks, and shadowy predators of Flores had taught them to observe before approaching. Communication between the two species would have been challenging. If the Hobbits had simple vocalizations, gestures, or facial expressions, modern humans might have recognized some intentions: fear, caution, friendliness. But complex language would have been out of reach. Any interaction would have depended heavily on nonverbal cues, shared behaviors, and observation. The key question remains: what impact would modern humans have had on the Hobbits' survival? Even without direct violence, modern humans could have altered the island's delicate ecological balance. Their advanced tools, controlled fires, and coordinated hunting strategies might have reduced prey species more rapidly than the environment could replenish. Gigantic stegodons, already under pressure, could have been hunted to extinction more quickly with spears, traps, and fire drives. The Hobbits, dependent on these animals for food and scavenging opportunities, would have felt the effects immediately. Modern humans also carried diseases, pathogens that evolved alongside larger populations and complex societies. To an isolated species like Homo floresiensis, these diseases could have been devastating. Even a mild illness could spread rapidly through a small population with no immunity, weakening survival chances and reproductive success. Competition for shelter may have played a role as well. Caves like Liang Bua were ideal for protection, storage, and fire use. If modern humans claimed such spaces, the Hobbits might have been forced into less secure shelters, increasing exposure to predators and harsh weather. The psychological weight of displacement, losing familiar spaces, could have further impacted their survival. But one must also consider the possibility of peaceful coexistence, however brief. The two species may have avoided each other through natural territorial separation. Modern humans may not have stayed long on Flores, passing through without significantly disrupting the Hobbits' routines. The oceans, unpredictable and perilous, may have limited human migration into the deeper parts of the island. In this scenario, contact would have been minimal, perhaps limited to distant sightings or brief encounters. Yet the timing of the Hobbits' extinction remains a powerful clue. The overlap between the arrival of modern humans in the region and the disappearance of Homo floresiensis is unlikely to be coincidence. Across the world, whenever modern humans encountered other hominin species, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, Homo floresiensis in the Philippines, those species eventually vanished. Sometimes the cause was direct competition, sometimes environmental stressors, and sometimes genetic absorption. In the case of the hobbits, however, interbreeding seems unlikely given the extreme anatomical differences between the two species. The emotional weight of this possibility is profound. Imagine the last groups of hobbits retreating deeper into the forest as tall strangers explored the island. Their numbers already reduced by ecological decline, they now had to contend with a new and powerful presence. Perhaps they attempted to avoid detection, staying quiet in caves or moving at night. Maybe their curiosity led a few individuals to observe the newcomers from a safe distance, their small eyes reflecting firelight through leaves. These moments, unrecorded and silent, may have been the final interactions between two distant branches of the human family tree. If modern humans did see the hobbits, they likely struggled to categorize them. Were they humans? Animals? Spirits? Children of the forest? For a species steeped in myth-making, the hobbits might have become subjects of stories, tales of small forest beings who vanished as mysteriously as they appeared. In the end, whether through competition, ecological displacement, disease, or simple chance, the meeting between the tall cousins and the tiny islanders likely marked the beginning of the end. The hobbits, so perfectly adapted to their isolated world, were unprepared for the arrival of humans shaped by global migrations, powerful minds, and rapidly advancing technology. The story of their final encounter, real or imagined, is a reminder of the fragility of isolated species in the face of change. It also reflects our own deep past, where humanity's expansion often came at the cost of other branches of our family tree. The hobbits were not conquered or assimilated, they simply faded as the world around them shifted. In this brief and mysterious meeting, two distant relatives shared the same island for a fleeting moment in time. One would go on to dominate the planet. The other would disappear into legend. Long after Homo floresiensis vanished from Flores, the island's people continued to speak of small, elusive beings who lived deep within the forests. These creatures, known in local folklore as the Abugogo, occupy a strange space between myth and memory, a haunting echo of a distant past that may preserve traces of real encounters with the last surviving hobbits. The mythology surrounding these beings is filled with whispers of mischief, mystery, and fear, painting a picture that feels almost too close to the hobbits' known characteristics to ignore. According to the oral traditions of the Nage people who inhabit central Flores, the Abugogo were small, hairy, pot-bellied human-like creatures who walked upright and spoke in murmuring voices that mimicked human speech without fully forming clear words. Their name roughly translates to the grandmother who eats everything, a reference to their voracious appetites and their tendency, according to legend, to steal food from human settlements. Their reputation painted them as both comical and dangerous, mischievous beings who lurked at the edges of society, avoiding direct contact but always watching. Stories describe the Abugogo as living in caves, moving through dense forests with surprising stealth, and working together in small groups to gather food. They were described as capable of understanding human speech but unable to articulate proper language themselves, a trait eerily reminiscent of how a species like Homo floresiensis might have interacted with early human settlers. Their movements were said to be quick, their behavior unpredictable, their presence unsettling yet undeniably human-like. One of the most compelling aspects of the Abugogo myth is the timeline associated with it. Some local traditions claim that the Abugogo survived until only a few centuries ago, far more recent than the archaeological dates for Homo floresiensis. If true, this would imply that a remnant hobbit population existed long after science believes they disappeared. While such claims remain unproven, they hold a powerful fascination. Could local stories preserve memories of encounters with an ancient human species? Could the myths be the cultural residue of a lost species lingering at the edge of recorded history? To understand the power of this folklore, one must consider how memory is preserved in isolated communities. In many indigenous cultures, oral traditions serve as historical record, carried from generation to generation for hundreds or even thousands of years. These stories transform over time, blending fact with superstition, but often retain kernels of truth. The possibility that the Abu-Gogo stories emerged from real interactions between early humans and late surviving hobbits is not easily dismissed. Some tales describe the Abu-Gogo as crafty and clever, capable of imitating human actions but lacking refinement. They allegedly stole crops, livestock, and even children. On rare occasions. According to myth, one group of villagers eventually grew tired of the Abu-Gogo's intrusions and trapped them in a cave, setting fire to its entrance to eliminate them. The story ends with the creature's disappearance, a dramatic and symbolic conclusion that bears unsettling similarity to the sudden vanishing of Homo floresiensis from the archaeological record. While such stories cannot be taken as literal fact, they raise intriguing questions. If the hobbits survived longer than science currently believes, they might have lived in diminishing numbers, retreating deeper into forests as human populations expanded. Their small stature, unusual anatomy, and distinct vocalizations would have seemed mysterious, even supernatural, to early villagers. Over time, their presence could have shifted from lived reality to mythic memory, giving rise to the legend of the Abu-Gogo. Some anthropologists argue that the parallels between the mythical creatures and Homo floresiensis are too strong to ignore. Both are described as small, hairy, cave-dwelling beings with limited speech and peculiar movements. Both inhabited the rugged landscapes of Flores. And both left behind traces, either in folklore or in ancient bones, that point to a creature unlike any modern human. The convergence of mythology and science suggests that local people may have preserved stories of the hobbits long after they disappeared from the archaeological layers of Liangbua. Yet the myth is not without its ambiguities. The Abu-Gogo are often portrayed with exaggerated features, long arms, hunched backs, unfocused eyes, which could reflect embellishments or symbolic storytelling rather than literal descriptions. Their portrayal as greedy or mischievous beings may represent cultural anxieties or moral lessons rather than historical memory. Myths often serve purposes beyond simple recollection. They explain natural events, establish boundaries between groups, or teach lessons about cooperation and conflict. Nevertheless, the idea that Homo floresiensis influenced local folklore adds a deeply human dimension to their story. It bridges the gap between science and culture, revealing that even after a species disappears, it can leave imprints not just in bones but in stories, fears, and imaginations. The Abu-Gogo myth reflects a profound truth: humans have always shared their world with others, sometimes different, sometimes familiar, always mysterious. For the people of Flores, these stories are not just tales of the past but reminders of the island's deep history. Even today, elders speak of the Abu-Gogo with a mixture of caution and nostalgia. Caves are treated with respect, forests with reverence, as though the island remembers something the modern world has forgotten. Whether the Abu-Gogo were real encounters with the last hobbits or symbolic representations of human anxieties, their presence in local lore enriches the narrative of Homo floresiensis. It reminds us that the past is not always silent. Sometimes it echoes through mythology, whispering fragments of forgotten lives. The hobbits may have vanished from Flores long ago, but in the stories of the Abu-Gogo, they continue to walk the forests, tiny shadows lingering at the edge of memory, where science and legend meet. Extinction is rarely a loud event. It doesn't always arrive with volcanic fury or a dramatic clash between species. More often, it comes quietly, through absence, through stillness, through the slow fading of footsteps that once echoed across a landscape. The end of Homo floresiensis was not marked by a single catastrophic moment but by a gradual slipping away, a disappearance so quiet that the island itself seemed to swallow their presence. As time passed, Flores returned to silence where once the soft patter of tiny feet had moved across forest floors, riverbanks, and cave entrances. Imagine the forests after their final decline. Paths once worn by hobbit travel began to close, swallowed by undergrowth. Vines curled over abandoned routes, and fallen leaves erased the signs of their passing. The caves they once occupied grew empty. Hearths turned cold. Charcoal faded into dust. The echoes of their voices, whatever form those voices took, ceased to resonate within the stone chambers of Liangbua. All that remained were small traces buried beneath layers of sediment, waiting for discovery thousands of years later. For a species that had survived countless cycles of environmental stress, predators, and resource scarcity, such a quiet vanishing feels almost unfitting. But extinction often comes through the cumulative weight of small pressures rather than a single overwhelming blow. For the Hobbits, each generation faced slightly fewer resources, fewer surviving companions, fewer children, fewer safe spaces. Bit by bit, their world shrank. And when their world became too small to sustain them, their presence simply faded from the island's daily rhythm. One of the most haunting aspects of their disappearance is the profound loneliness that likely surrounded their final years. The Hobbits lived in small groups, and as their numbers dwindled, these groups must have fractured into isolated pockets, perhaps 2 or 3 individuals wandering the forest, still following ancient routines but feeling the loss of community. Social species rely on one another for survival, comfort, and learning. The last Hobbits may have lived without the support network that once sustained their ancestors, making each day a little more perilous, each night a little colder. The island of Flores itself would not have noticed their passing. Nature continues regardless of who walks upon it. Trees grow, rivers carve new paths, and animals adapt to new ecological roles. The absence of the Hobbits may have allowed new species to flourish, freed from human foraging pressures. The silence that followed their extinction was not unnatural, it was simply another phase in the island's restless transformation. Yet despite this indifference of nature, the emotional weight of their absence feels profound to us. Humans today, with our deep sense of connection to the wider human family tree, cannot help but imagine the final Hobbit sitting alone near the entrance of Liangbua, watching the sky shift from blue to orange to black. We imagine them listening to distant thunder, to the rustle of leaves, to the calls of birds settling into their nests. We imagine them calling out for companions who never respond. These images, though speculative, are grounded in the universal experience of loneliness that accompanies dwindling populations. As the Hobbits disappeared, so too did their knowledge, their understanding of Flores' hidden trails, edible plants, and seasonal rhythms. Knowledge that had been shaped across thousands of years dissolved in a single generation. No one remained to pass it on. No one remained to teach a child how to hunt giant rats, navigate the landscape, or find safe shelter during volcanic storms. The cultural memory of an entire species vanished as quietly as the species itself. In the layers of Liangbua, archaeologists can see the silence take shape. The sediment above the last Hobbit remains contains fewer tool fragments, fewer signs of fire, fewer bones marked by butchering. The occupation layers grow thinner and finally disappear entirely. The cave marks the transition from a place of life, where Hobbit groups gathered, cooked, and sheltered, to a place reclaimed by nature, where bats roost and dust settled undisturbed. For thousands of years after their extinction, no one on Flores knew that a unique human species had once lived there. The Hobbits left no art on cave walls, no carvings on stones, nothing that could cry out through time. Only their bones, tools, and the faintest echoes of their presence remained hidden until 2003. Their story was kept not by memory but by geology, by the earth itself, pressing their remains gently into darkness. And yet, even in their disappearance, the Hobbits left a legacy. Their extinction reminds us of the fragility of isolated species, of the delicate nature of survival in environments with limited resources. It reminds us that evolution does not guarantee permanence. It also challenges us to empathize with the smallest branches of our human family tree, those who lived lives full of struggle, adaptation, and resilience, only to be forgotten until chance revealed them again. The silence after their footsteps is not merely the silence of extinction, it is the silence before rediscovery. When scientists finally uncovered their remains, they didn't just find bones, they found a voice that had been quiet for tens of thousands of years. A voice that speaks not through words, but through the shape of a skull, the edge of a tool, the pattern of soot in a hearth. The silence gave way to questions, curiosity, and a renewed appreciation for the diversity of human forms. Today, standing at the mouth of Liang Bua, one can feel that silence still lingering. It is a silence filled with wonder, not emptiness. A silence that invites reflection on survival, adaptation, and the passage of deep time. The hobbits may be gone, but the story of their final fading remains one of the most poignant chapters in human evolution, a reminder of how easily a lineage can vanish, and how profoundly its traces can move us when rediscovered. In the quiet that followed their disappearance, Flores moved on. But the world, once unaware of their existence, now carries their memory, lifting the silence with each step we take toward understanding who they were and what they left behind. When the bones of Homo floresiensis first emerged from the sediments of Liang Bua, the world reacted with astonishment, skepticism, and curiosity. But that initial wave of discovery was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, scientists returned to Flores again and again, driven by questions that refused to fade. Each new expedition, each microscopic analysis, each re-evaluated sediment layer deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Science, with its endless hunger for truth, gave the hobbits a second look, one far more detailed, rigorous, and expansive than the first. The first years after the discovery were dominated by debates about pathology versus species distinction. But as more data accumulated, the focus shifted. Researchers began examining the hobbit from every possible angle: anatomy, genetics, geology, archaeology, ecology, and even comparative cognition. Liang Bua became a hub of interdisciplinary exploration. The cave walls that had stood silently for tens of thousands of years now echoed with voices from around the world, scientists mapping, measuring, digging, sampling, and theorizing. One of the first major breakthroughs came from new dating techniques. Early estimates had placed the hobbit remains at around 18,000 years old, but later analyses using refined radiocarbon and luminescence methods pushed the date back dramatically, to around 50,000 years. This revelation shifted the entire narrative. It placed Homo floresiensis firmly within the timeframe of modern human expansion across Southeast Asia. Suddenly, the possibility of contact, competition, or coexistence with Homo sapiens became far more plausible. The hobbit's disappearance aligned almost too perfectly with the arrival of our species in the region. Sediment analysis also told new stories. Microscopic particles of ash revealed past volcanic eruptions with remarkable accuracy. Pollen grains indicated which plants dominated the landscape during various periods, shedding light on climate shifts that may have challenged the hobbit's survival. Even tiny traces of animal bones in the sediments helped reconstruct the food web of ancient Flores. Science began painting a picture of a world in flux, a world the hobbits had navigated with skill, but not without struggle. Anatomical re-evaluations added further intrigue. High-resolution CT scans of the hobbit skulls allowed researchers to examine internal structures with unprecedented clarity. The shape of the brain cavity suggested that, despite its small size, the brain of Homo floresiensis may have been organized in ways that supported advanced motor skills and problem-solving. Regions associated with planning and decision-making appeared to be proportionally developed, hinting that the hobbits were cognitively sophisticated in ways not immediately obvious from their tiny skulls. The wrist bones, too, attracted significant attention. Early comparisons to Homo habilis had hinted at primitive traits, but further studies confirmed that these traits were genuine and not the result of deformation or disease. The wrist and shoulder anatomy placed the hobbits well outside the modern human range, strengthening the argument that they represented a distinct species with deep evolutionary roots. Their lineage, whatever it was, had diverged long before Homo sapiens emerged. Meanwhile, archaeologists expanded their search beyond Liang Bua. Excavations in other parts of Flores revealed ancient stone tools dating back hundreds of thousands of years, long before the known hobbit fossils. These tools suggested a long-standing hominin presence on the island, potentially predating the arrival of the ancestors of Homo floresiensis. Whether these early toolmakers were the direct ancestors of the Hobbits or belonged to another unknown species remains uncertain. But their presence hinted at a deeper, more complex human history on Flores than anyone originally imagined. Scientists also attempted genetic analysis, hoping to extract DNA from Hobbit remains. Unfortunately, the hot and humid environment of Flores degraded DNA too quickly for preservation. Attempts at recovery produced no usable results. While disappointing, this limitation only increased curiosity. Without DNA, the Hobbits' ancestry could not be traced through genetics, leaving morphology and archaeological context as the primary clues to their origin. Their lineage remained shrouded in mystery, a puzzle the world's most advanced technology could not yet solve. New theories emerged as research progressed. Some scientists proposed that Homo floresiensis descended from an unknown, early migration out of Africa, a small-bodied hominin that left no fossil trail on the mainland. Others argued that their evolution represented extreme island dwarfism in Homo erectus, with primitive features emerging through evolutionary reversal. Still others believed the Hobbit belonged to a branch of the human family tree entirely separate from other known species, one that thrived in Southeast Asia long before more famous lineages rose and fell elsewhere. Despite the disagreements, one thing grew increasingly clear: Homo floresiensis was not a diseased or malformed Homo sapiens. The weight of evidence, anatomical, environmental, archaeological, overwhelmingly supported their status as a distinct species. The scientific community gradually shifted from skepticism to acceptance, acknowledging the Hobbit as a legitimate and extraordinary part of human evolution. As scientists took their second look, they did more than analyze bones, they re-examined assumptions about what it means to be human. The Hobbit forced a reconsideration of the link between brain size and intelligence, the nature of tool-making, the diversity of ancient hominins, and the complexity of evolutionary paths. It expanded the boundaries of possibility, showing that human-like species could evolve in ways previously considered improbable or impossible. Today, Liangbua remains an active and evolving research site. New methods continue to extract fresh insights from old sediments. Each discovery, no matter how small, adds another thread to the tapestry of the Hobbit story. The scientific world continues to pull at these threads, knowing that somewhere in the cave's depths, or perhaps elsewhere on Flores, the answers to the Hobbit's greatest mysteries may still lie buried. Science's second look at Homo floresiensis demonstrates how understanding deepens over time, not through rushed conclusions, but through patience, persistence, and constant questioning. The Hobbit's legacy lives not only in fossils but in the curiosity they inspire. They remind us that even after a species disappears from the earth, its story can continue to grow, evolve, and surprise us. Science keeps looking, keeps asking, keeps seeking, and in doing so, it ensures that the tiny humans of Flores will never again be lost to time. In the quiet bones of Homo floresiensis lies a message far larger than their tiny forms suggest, a message about what it truly means to be human. Their story is not merely one of biology or archaeology, it is a mirror held up to our own species, reflecting aspects of humanity we often overlook. The Hobbits challenge our assumptions, expand our imagination, and remind us that the human identity is broader, deeper, and more complex than we ever believed. Through their lives, their adaptations, and their disappearance, they reveal profound truths about intelligence, resilience, diversity, and the fragile nature of existence. One of the most striking lessons they offer is that intelligence does not look the same in every lineage. For centuries, human evolution was framed as a march toward bigger brains and more complex thinking. But the Hobbits break this narrative completely. With brains no larger than those of chimpanzees, they crafted tools, controlled fire, hunted strategically, and navigated a dangerous ecosystem filled with predators and unpredictable weather. Their abilities force us to question the assumption that cognitive worth is measured in volume. Instead, they suggest that intelligence can be compact, efficient, and highly specialized, sculpted by environment rather than by sheer size. The Hobbits also invite reflection on what defines humanity at its core. For modern humans, we often tie identity to technology, language, art, and social complexity. But the Hobbits lived with none of the grand cultural markers that define Homo sapiens. They left no elaborate art, no monumental structures, no sprawling settlements. Yet they lived fully functional human lives, cooperative, adaptive, emotional, and deeply intertwined with their environment. Their existence reminds us that humanity is not defined by what we build, but by how we survive, how we communicate, and how we make meaning from the world around us, even in the simplest ways. Their small stature reveals something even deeper, that the human form is not fixed. When placed in extreme isolation, under relentless environmental pressure, human bodies and minds adapt in ways that can seem almost alien. The Hobbits shrank because shrinking helped them endure. Their evolution was not a mistake or a step backward, it was a successful solution to a challenging ecological puzzle. This teaches us that evolution does not aim toward a perfect human, it responds to context, and humanity can take shapes beyond anything we imagine. In the Hobbit story, we also find lessons about vulnerability. While they thrived for thousands of years, they lived closer to the edge of extinction than most human species. A single drought, a shift in prey availability, a volcanic eruption, or the arrival of a new competitor could destabilize their fragile existence. Their disappearance underscores how precarious survival can be for any species, including our own. It reminds us that dominance is not permanence, and that environmental balance is essential for long-term survival. One of the most profound aspects of their legacy is the reminder that we were never alone. For most of human history, Homo sapiens coexisted with other human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and the Hobbits. We shared the world with beings who were different from us, yet fundamentally human in their own ways. Modern humans often imagine ourselves as the sole inheritors of the human journey, but the Hobbits help restore the truth. We are part of a diverse family tree filled with branches that once flourished, intertwined, and influenced one another. This diversity challenges our sense of uniqueness and invites humility. The Hobbits also illuminate the idea that survival does not always require progress, sometimes it requires constancy. While other human species evolved expanding brains or advanced tools, the Hobbits maintained a stable lifestyle that worked for their environment. They did not need to innovate rapidly, they needed to endure. Their tools remained simple because simplicity was effective. Their brain size remained small because efficiency was advantageous. Their strategies remained consistent because they had no need to change. This reveals that what works for one lineage may not work for another, and progress is not a universal metric but a contextual one. Perhaps the most emotional lesson they offer is about the fragility of memory. The Hobbits lived for countless generations, yet no living human would have known of them without the fortunate discovery of their remains. They left no written history, no oral tradition that survived into the global consciousness, no direct descendants. Without archaeology, their existence would have been lost forever. This reality should make us pause and reflect. How many human stories have vanished without leaving a trace? How many branches of our family tree disappeared silently? The Hobbits remind us that memory requires preservation, and that the earth still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered. Their story also challenges us to expand our definition of belonging. In a world where humanity is often divided by appearance, culture, nationality, or belief, the Hobbits show that even the most physically different members of the human lineage deserve recognition, dignity, and inclusion in our collective identity. They broaden the circle of us, reminding us that humanity has always been varied. The Hobbits' relationship with their environment conveys another profound insight: coexistence with nature is essential. They lived without dominating or overwhelming their island. They existed in a balance shaped by the limits of Flores, adapting rather than transforming. In contrast, modern humans often reshape ecosystems to fit our needs. The Hobbits' quiet, adaptive lifestyle offers a humility that modern societies could learn from, a reminder that sustainability is not a luxury but a necessity. Finally, the Hobbits teach us something about curiosity. The fact that their discovery ignited global fascination reveals a deep human desire to understand our origins. Their small bones unlocked enormous questions. Where did we come from? What could we have become? What other paths did evolution explore? The Hobbits enrich our sense of wonder, showing that the human past is not closed but alive with possibilities. In their tiny frames, Homo floresiensis carried immense significance. They were storytellers of evolution, whispering tales of adaptation, resilience, and diversity. They force us to look beyond modern human features and see humanity in forms that defy expectation. Their lives ask us to rethink intelligence, redefine identity, reconsider survival, and embrace the complexity of our heritage. In the end, what the Hobbits tell us about being human is simple yet profound. Humanity is not a singular destiny but a spectrum of possibilities. We are shaped by environment, time, chance, and adaptation. We are one branch of a vast tree, not the inevitable endpoint. And through the Hobbits, we glimpse the beautiful, unpredictable creativity of evolution, reminding us that the human story is richer, stranger, and far more expansive than we ever imagined. Flores is more than the backdrop of the Hobbit story, it is the silent witness that carries their memory long after their footsteps faded. Its forests, rivers, and ancient volcanic slopes still hold echoes of the tiny humans who once adapted so perfectly to its rugged terrain. Though the Hobbits are gone, the island's landscapes whisper fragments of their lives, the caves they sheltered in, the trails they walked, the places where their fires once flickered against stone. Over thousands of years, storms reshaped valleys and vegetation reclaimed open paths, yet the essence of their presence lingers in the soil. Flores remembers them in the way its ecosystems evolved without them, in the myths passed down through generations, and in the bones preserved beneath its shifting earth. Here, humanity once existed in a form both strange and familiar, and the island keeps their story alive in silence.